Welcome back to another episode of Lazy History, where we uncover the brutal truths behind the romanticized tales of medieval times. Today, we're stepping into the year 1315. But we're not here to talk about knights in shining armor or nobles feasting in their great halls. No, we're here to talk about something far more horrifying. The forgotten catastrophe that killed millions across Europe through starvation, desperation, and acts so unthinkable that chroniclers struggle to record them. So settle in, as we explore the dark, waterlogged, and utterly unforgiving world of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. When civilized Europe descended into hell on earth, the story begins not with the famine itself, but with prosperity so abundant that no one could imagine it ending. To understand the horror that was about to unfold, we first need to grasp just how extraordinary life had been for the 3 centuries leading up to 1315. This wasn't just a period of mild improvement. This was Europe's demographic and economic golden age. From around the year 1000 to 1300 AD, Europe had experienced what historians call the medieval warm period. Temperatures were warmer than they had been in centuries, growing seasons stretched longer than anyone could remember, and harvests were more reliable than anything Europe had experienced before or would experience again for hundreds of years. This wasn't just slightly better weather. This was a climatic transformation that allowed farmers to cultivate lands that had never before supported crops. Grain could be grown successfully in regions of Scotland where it would be impossible today. Vineyards flourished in England, producing wine that competed with French varieties. The tree line moved higher up mountainsides as temperatures warmed, opening vast new areas for human settlement. The demographic explosion that followed was unprecedented in European history. Villages that had supported a few dozen families suddenly housed hundreds. Towns grew into cities, and new settlements spread across landscapes that had been empty wilderness for centuries. Vast forests were cleared, turning ancient woodlands into productive farmland. Marshlands were drained through elaborate systems of ditches and dikes, creating some of the most fertile agricultural land in Europe. Between the year 1000 and 1300, Europe's population nearly tripled. By some estimates, the continent went from supporting roughly 35 million people to over 80 million. This wasn't gradual growth spread over centuries. This was rapid, explosive population expansion that completely transformed the social and economic structure of medieval Europe. But here's the terrifying reality that no one understood at the time. This demographic boom was built on borrowed time, supported by unusually favorable weather conditions that were already beginning to change. By 1300, Europe had become a continent living right at the edge of subsistence. Every acre of arable land was under cultivation. Every favorable microclimate had been settled. The agricultural technology of the time was being pushed to its absolute limits. Medieval farming techniques, while sophisticated for their time, were still primitive by modern standards. A good harvest might yield 7 grains for every one planted, but even that impressive return required perfect weather conditions. There was no margin for error, no buffer against crop failure, and no way to quickly recover from even a single bad season. The continent had become a demographic powder keg. All it would take was one series of bad harvests to push millions of people over the edge from subsistence into starvation. And that's exactly what happened. The first warning signs appeared during the unusually harsh winter of 1314 to 1315. The cold was more severe than anyone could remember, and it lingered far longer than normal. Rivers froze solid for weeks, making transportation impossible. Livestock suffered and died in the bitter conditions. Food stores that should have lasted through the winter were depleted early as families burned through reserves trying to survive the extended cold. But when spring finally arrived in 1315, it brought something that medieval farmers had never experienced on such a devastating scale: relentless torrential rainfall that would continue almost without interruption for over 2 years. Picture this scene. It's March 1315, and across Europe, farmers are preparing for the planting season. This is the most critical time of the agricultural year, when seeds must be placed in properly prepared soil to ensure a successful harvest. But instead of the gentle spring rains that help crops grow, the skies opened with a vengeance that seemed almost supernatural. Contemporary chroniclers described the rainfall in terms that bordered on apocalyptic. Week after week of heavy downpours turned entire regions into vast lakes. Rivers that had flowed peacefully for centuries burst their banks, flooding thousands of acres of productive farmland. In England, the lowlands of Yorkshire and Nottingham disappeared under sheets of standing water that stretched to the horizon. The Chronicle of Lanercost, one of the most reliable contemporary sources, described the weather as bizarre and unlike anything that had been seen in living memory. Torrential rains flooded fields, rotting crops where they lay and drowning livestock that couldn't reach higher ground. But the real disaster was happening in the fields themselves. Under normal circumstances, spring rains help seeds germinate and provide the moisture young plants need to establish strong root systems. But when there's too much water, when the soil becomes completely saturated and waterlogged, seeds don't grow. They rot in the ground before they can even begin to sprout. Imagine being a medieval farmer in the spring of 1315, watching your entire future dissolve in the mud. The carefully prepared fields that should have been receiving their precious cargo of seed grain were instead turned into impassable swamps. Plowing became impossible as draft animals sank up to their bellies in waterlogged soil. Even where planting had been completed before the worst of the rains, the seeds rotted in the ground or were washed away by the flooding. The timing couldn't have been worse. Medieval agriculture operated on razor-thin margins, with most families keeping just enough seed grain to plant the next year's crop and just enough food to last until the next harvest. There were no large strategic reserves, no government stockpiles, and no international trade networks that could quickly supply food during emergencies. Each community was essentially dependent on its own local production. As the failed spring planting became undeniable, panic began to set in across Europe. Farmers who had expected to plant their fields in March and April found themselves still unable to work the waterlogged soil in May and June. Even where some planting had been accomplished, the constant rain and lack of sunshine meant that crops grew poorly or not at all. The hay and straw that should have been drying in the fields to provide animal feed through the winter couldn't be properly cured in the constant dampness. Livestock that weren't already dying from disease or drowning in the floods faced starvation as their food supplies rotted away. Cattle, sheep, and pigs began dying in massive numbers. Some regions lost 80% of their livestock within the first year of the crisis. Even salt, absolutely essential for preserving meat and fish in an age without refrigeration, became impossible to produce. Salt making required the evaporation of seawater or brine from salt springs, but with constant humidity and rain, the salt pans couldn't function properly. The price of salt skyrocketed from 30 shillings per quarter to 40 shillings, making this essential preservative unaffordable for all but the wealthiest merchants and nobles. As the reality of the failed harvest of 1315 became inescapable, something truly terrifying began to happen across Europe. Food prices didn't just increase gradually as they might during a normal shortage. They exploded beyond anything anyone had ever imagined possible. In England, grain prices doubled between spring and midsummer, then doubled again. In Lorraine, wheat prices rose by an astronomical 320% within a matter of months. But these raw numbers, dramatic as they are, don't capture the human reality of what was happening to ordinary people. Bread, the absolute foundation of medieval life, became so expensive that working families couldn't afford it at any price. In London, chroniclers recorded that a quarter of wheat was selling for 38 to 40 shillings, while just 2 small onions cost a penny. To put this in perspective, these were prices that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Parliament, recognizing the growing crisis, attempted to implement price controls to make food affordable for ordinary people. King Edward Roman II and his advisors fixed the price of wheat, sheep, cattle, chickens, and eggs. They decreed that a live fat cow should cost 12 shillings and that 2 dozen hens should sell for just a penny. This is a noble attempt to prevent profiteering during a crisis, but it proved to be an economic disaster. With food so scarce and production costs so high, farmers and traders simply couldn't operate at the government-mandated prices. Many stopped bringing their goods to market entirely rather than sell at a loss. The price controls, intended to help ordinary people, actually made the food shortage worse by reducing the incentive to produce and distribute what little food was available. The failure of the price control system became evident in a particularly embarrassing incident for the royal government. In August 1315, King Edward Roman II arrived at the wealthy monastery of St. Albans with his entire royal household, expecting to be housed and fed in the lavish style that befitted a king. This was a common practice during royal progresses, where the king would travel from place to place, staying with nobles and religious institutions who were honored to host the royal party, despite the enormous expense involved. But this time was different. Despite St. Albans being one of the wealthiest religious houses in England, the monks struggled to find enough bread to feed the king and his entourage. For the first time in living memory, the King of England went hungry. If even the royal households couldn't obtain adequate food, what hope did ordinary peasants have? By the autumn of 1315, the price control system was quietly abandoned as completely unworkable. Food prices were allowed to rise to whatever levels the market would bear, and the results were devastating for the common people. A quarter barrel of wheat containing about 13 kilograms of grain rose in price from 5 shillings to 40 shillings. What had cost a few pence months earlier now required more money than most people earned in an entire month. The social implications of these price increases were staggering. Bread had been the staple food that provided the majority of calories for medieval people. When bread became unaffordable, there were few alternatives. Most people didn't have access to meat, fish, or dairy products on a regular basis even during good times. Now, with livestock dying and preserved foods unavailable due to the salt shortage, ordinary people faced genuine starvation. The wealthy had anticipated potential shortages and stockpiled grain during better times, but these stores were reserved for royalty, high nobles, wealthy merchants, and the church. The common people, who made up over 90% of the population, had no such reserves. They were entirely dependent on each season's harvest, and now that harvest had failed completely. By the winter of 1315, something that had been unthinkable just a year earlier was becoming commonplace across Europe, genuine, it is starvation. This wasn't the mild hunger that occasionally accompanied poor harvests in isolated regions. This was a kind of widespread, severe malnutrition that kills people by the thousands. Desperate families began doing things that would have been inconceivable during the prosperous centuries. They ventured into forests to dig up wild roots, hoping to find anything edible buried in the waterlogged soil. They stripped bark from trees, particularly from oak and elm, grinding it into a coarse flour that could be mixed with whatever grain remained to make a bitter, barely nutritious bread. People gathered whatever wild plants they could find, boiling grass into thin soup that provided little nourishment but helped fill empty stomachs. Acorns, normally fed to pigs, became prized sources of nutrition for humans. Families competed with wildlife for berries, nuts, and any other natural food sources they could locate. Even these desperate foraging attempts were hampered by the continuing bad weather. The same rains that had destroyed the crops also made foraging nearly impossible. Roots rotted in the waterlogged soil before they could be harvested. Wild plants were scarce and often inedible after months of flooding. The forests and fields that should have provided emergency food sources were as devastated as the agricultural lands. In the cities, the situation was even more dire than in rural areas. Urban populations had no ability to forage for wild foods and were entirely dependent on whatever made it to market. As rural populations fled to cities seeking help, the urban areas became overcrowded death traps where disease spread rapidly among the malnourished masses. The migration of starving rural people to cities created a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions. City authorities, already struggling to feed their own populations, were overwhelmed by the influx of desperate refugees. Makeshift camps sprung up outside city walls, housing thousands of people with no resources and no prospects for survival. Perhaps most shocking was how quickly the thin veneer of medieval civilization began to crack under the pressure of mass starvation. Crime rates didn't just increase gradually. They exploded overnight as desperate people turned to any means necessary to obtain food. Theft, robbery, and violence became commonplace as families that had lived peacefully side by side for generations now viewed each other with suspicion and fear. Reports began filtering in from across Europe of crimes that would have been unthinkable during the prosperous years. People broke into churches to steal whatever food might be stored there, despite the severe religious and legal penalties for such sacrilege. Gardens were stripped bare under cover of darkness. Any remaining livestock were slaughtered regardless of ownership, as the concept of property rights began to break down under the pressure of survival. The winter of 1315 to 1316 brought horrors that medieval chroniclers found almost impossible to describe. Across Europe, people were dying not just from direct starvation, but from diseases that thrived among weakened, malnourished populations. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis swept through communities that had no resistance left to fight them. The combination of malnutrition and disease created a mortality crisis that went far beyond what hunger alone could have caused. People weakened by months of inadequate nutrition had no ability to fight off infections that would have been minor inconveniences during normal times. What began as starvation quickly escalated into a general health catastrophe. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that seem almost biblical in their horror. The Chronicle of Lanercost recorded such a mortality of men in England and Scotland through famine and pestilence as had not been heard of in our time. Cities that had been thriving centres of commerce just months earlier were now filled with the bodies of people who had died in the streets. In Bristol, the city chronicles recorded conditions so dire that they defied belief. A great famine of death with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horse flesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear in pieces such as were newly put into prison, and devour them half alive. This account, while potentially exaggerated, reflects the breakdown of normal social order that was occurring across Europe. Prisons, traditionally places where criminals were held for punishment, became sites of cannibalistic violence as starving prisoners turned on each other in desperate attempts to survive. Reports began filtering in from across Europe of incidents that would have been unthinkable during the good years. People were abandoning their children, not out of cruelty, but out of desperate hope that someone else might be able to provide the care and food they could no longer supply. The famous fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, with its theme of children abandoned in the forest during a time of famine, likely originated from the traumatic experiences of this period. The story of Hansel and Gretel takes on a much darker meaning when understood in the context of the Great Famine. The tale of parents forced to abandon their children in the woods because they cannot feed them wasn't fantasy. It was a desperate reality that thousands of medieval families faced during these years. The gingerbread house, too good to be true, represented the impossible dream of abundant food during a time of starvation. As the crisis deepened, people resorted to eating anything that might provide nutrition. Dogs, cats, and horses became sources of meat, despite cultural taboos against consuming these animals. In Berwick, starving soldiers were reduced to boiling and eating the carcasses of their diseased horses. The flesh was often contaminated and dangerous to consume, but starvation drove people to take risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The livestock mortality created additional problems beyond the immediate loss of food sources. Cattle, sheep, and pigs were dying in massive numbers from diseases that chroniclers called murrain, likely a form of foot-and-mouth disease or anthrax. In a normal year, when animals died, their meat could be preserved in salt for later consumption. But the salt shortage meant that most of this potential food simply rotted before it could be properly preserved. The waste was heartbreaking and infuriating for starving populations. They could see potential food literally rotting before their eyes, but without adequate salt for preservation, there was no way to save it for future consumption. People tried to eat the meat of diseased animals quickly before it spoiled, often leading to additional illness and death from food poisoning. In the darkest corners of this tragedy, whispered rumors began to spread of something even more horrifying than the consumption of pets and diseased livestock: cannibalism. Contemporary chroniclers recorded multiple accounts of people consuming human flesh, though historians continue to debate whether all of these reports were literal truth or exaggerated rumors meant to emphasize the severity of the crisis. Some accounts describe people digging up recently buried corpses and consuming the flesh. Others tell of murders committed specifically to obtain human meat for consumption. A particularly horrifying account from Burgundy describes how men and women, killed and ate other people. The chronicler goes on to describe specific incidents. Someone killed an honest woman welcomed by hospitality and, dividing her member by member, put her in the salt and cooked her so as to eat her with his children. Whether these accounts were entirely accurate or partially exaggerated, their very existence demonstrates the complete breakdown of normal social order. In a society where the church taught that the human body was sacred and where strong cultural taboos existed against the consumption of human flesh, even the rumor of cannibalism indicated a level of desperation that medieval people had never experienced before. The spring of 1316 brought no relief from the crisis. If anything, the situation grew worse as it became clear that the abnormal weather patterns were continuing for a second year. Farmers who had hoped that 1315 was simply an unusually bad year now faced the reality that they would be unable to plant adequate crops for a second consecutive season. By this point, any immediate food stores that had survived the first year of the crisis were completely exhausted. Even wealthy nobles and merchants, who had initially been able to weather the storm by purchasing food at inflated prices, were beginning to feel the pinch. The carefully maintained social hierarchy of medieval Europe was starting to collapse under the weight of universal hunger. The seed grain that should have been planted in the spring of 1316 had long since been consumed by starving families. Medieval agriculture depended on saving a portion of each harvest to plant the following season. This seed grain was typically carefully protected and reserved specifically for planting, but when people are starving, long-term planning becomes impossible. Families chose immediate survival over future harvests, consuming the seed grain and thereby ensuring that the crisis would continue even if the weather improved. Draft animals, essential for plowing and other agricultural work, were slaughtered for food. Oxen and horses that had taken years to train and represented enormous investments of time and resources were killed to provide a few meals for desperate families. This short-term survival strategy created long-term problems that would persist for years after the weather returned to normal. The demographic catastrophe was beginning to reveal its full scope. Historians estimate that mortality rates during 1316 reached 10 to 15% of the population in the most affected regions. In some areas, the death toll may have been even higher. To put this in modern terms, it would be equivalent to losing the entire populations of Texas and Florida within a single year. But the death toll from direct starvation was only part of the story. The weakened, malnourished populations that survived were incredibly vulnerable to diseases that would have been minor inconveniences during normal times. Typhus, in particular, spread rapidly through overcrowded areas where rural refugees had congregated seeking help. The combination of hunger and disease created a mortality crisis that went far beyond what starvation alone could have caused. Children were particularly vulnerable during the crisis. Their developing bodies required adequate nutrition to grow properly, and prolonged malnutrition had devastating effects on their health and development. Many children who survived the immediate crisis suffered from stunted growth and developmental problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Pregnant women faced impossible choices during the famine years. Their bodies, already stressed by malnutrition, often couldn't support the nutritional demands of pregnancy. Miscarriages became common, and many women who did carry pregnancies to term gave birth to weak, underweight babies who had little chance of survival. The elderly, already vulnerable due to age-related health issues, were among the first casualties of the crisis. But rather than being passive victims, many elderly people made the conscious choice to sacrifice themselves for the sake of younger family members. Contemporary accounts describe elderly people voluntarily starving themselves to death so that their children and grandchildren might have a better chance of survival. This practice of voluntary self-sacrifice became so common that it was recognized as a cultural norm during the famine years. Elderly people understood that their chances of surviving a prolonged crisis were slim, and they chose to give up their share of the scarce food so that younger family members, who were more likely to survive and could work the fields when the crisis ended, might live. As word of the continental catastrophe spread, political instability began to follow in its wake. Hungry populations don't remain passive indefinitely, and across Europe, the traditional bonds of feudal loyalty began to strain and break under the pressure of mass starvation. Peasants who had accepted their place in the social hierarchy for generations now questioned why they should continue to serve lords who couldn't protect them from starvation. The feudal system was built on the assumption that nobles would provide protection and security to their peasants in exchange for labor and agricultural products. But when the agricultural system collapsed and nobles proved just as helpless as everyone else against the crisis, the fundamental basis of feudal society was called into question. In some regions, something approaching class warfare erupted as desperate populations attacked the estates of the wealthy, seeking access to whatever food stores remained. These weren't organized rebellions with clear political goals, but rather the desperate actions of people who had nothing left to lose. The very foundations of medieval society, built on the assumption that the harvest would always come, were crumbling under the weight of universal hunger. Kings and nobles found their authority fundamentally undermined as they proved helpless against the disaster. What good were armies and castles against empty granaries? How could feudal oaths be honored when there was no food to distribute? The Great Famine was revealing the fundamental weakness of a social system that depended entirely on agricultural success. Even military campaigns became impossible to sustain during the crisis. Armies required enormous amounts of food to function, and with agricultural production collapse, there was simply no way to supply large military forces. The French King Louis X attempted to invade Flanders during the height of the famine, but his army became bogged down in the waterlogged lowlands of the Netherlands. The fields were so saturated that military movements became impossible, and the army was forced to retreat, burning their provisions where they abandoned them because they were unable to carry them away. The Church, which had been one of medieval Europe's most stable and powerful institutions, also found itself struggling to maintain authority during the crisis. For centuries, the Church had taught that God rewarded the faithful with earthly blessings and punished the wicked with suffering. But now, devout Christians were starving alongside everyone else, and even the most pious communities were experiencing the same devastating mortality rates. This created a profound crisis of faith that rippled through medieval society. If God was just and merciful, why were innocent children dying of hunger? If the Church truly had divine protection, why were monasteries and convents experiencing the same starvation as secular communities? These questions didn't have easy answers, and many people began to question fundamental religious teachings that had seemed unshakable just a few years earlier. Some religious leaders tried to frame the famine as divine punishment for collective sin, calling for increased penance and devotion. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Walter Reynolds, ordered parishes throughout the realm to participate in solemn processions in an attempt to curry favor with God and end the crisis through increased religious devotion. But these explanations rang hollow to populations that were watching their families waste away despite their prayers and good works. The confident Christian worldview that had dominated the High Middle Ages was being shattered by the reality of mass suffering that seemed to affect the righteous and wicked equally. By 1316, the crisis had reached such severity that even wealthy religious institutions were forced to take desperate measures. The Archbishop of Canterbury was forced to sell his holy relics to raise money for food. These relics, considered priceless spiritual treasures, were liquidated to purchase basic sustenance. The symbolism was profound. The Church was literally selling its spiritual heritage to survive. As the famine entered its second full year, reports were coming in from across Europe that painted a picture of continental devastation. From Scotland to Italy, from the Atlantic coast to the plains of Poland, the same story was being repeated: failed harvests, mass starvation, social breakdown, and death on an unprecedented scale. In Ireland, the situation was so desperate that English chroniclers reported levels of mortality that hadn't been seen in living memory. Scottish populations faced not only famine but also constant warfare, as political instability combined with starvation to create a perfect storm of suffering. French regions that had been prosperous and stable for generations were now experiencing peasant uprisings and social chaos. Northern England, already dealing with the effects of the famine, also had to contend with constant raids from starving Scots who crossed the border seeking food and plunder. The people of Northumbria were reduced to eating dogs and horses and other unclean things as they tried to survive both the famine and the violence. The scale of the catastrophe was truly continental. An estimated 30 to 40 million people lived in the affected regions, and a significant percentage of them would not survive the crisis. This wasn't a localized disaster that could be relieved by importing food from unaffected areas. This was a pan-European catastrophe that was reshaping the entire continent. The psychological impact of the Great Famine extended far beyond its immediate death toll. Survivors lived with trauma that would mark them for the rest of their lives. They had seen civilized society collapse, witnessed unthinkable acts of desperation, and experienced firsthand how quickly prosperity could turn to catastrophe. This trauma wasn't limited to individuals. Entire communities developed a collective memory of the famine years that would influence their behavior for generations. The confident expansion and population growth that had characterized the High Middle Ages was replaced by a more cautious, pessimistic outlook. People became more reluctant to have large families, more careful about clearing new farmland, and more suspicious of claims about perpetual prosperity. The cultural impact was equally profound. Art and literature from the period began to reflect darker themes, with increased focus on death, suffering, and the fragility of human existence. The optimistic Christian worldview that had dominated the High Middle Ages was tempered by a new awareness of how quickly divine favor could turn to apparent abandonment. Even folk tales and legends that emerged from this period reflected the trauma of the famine years. The story of the Mouse Tower of Bishop Haddo provides a particularly vivid example of how the crisis shaped popular culture. According to the legend, the Bishop of Bingen hoarded food during the famine while his people starved. When everyone else had died or fled, he found himself alone in his tower, surrounded by all the starving rats and mice from the region who had smelled his stored grain. The rats devoured the bishop, and to this day, visitors to the German city of Bingen are shown the stone tower where this supposedly occurred. Whether this story was based on actual events or was entirely fictional, it reflected the popular anger toward authorities who were seen as hoarding food while ordinary people starved. The tale served as both entertainment and social commentary, expressing the rage that common people felt toward those in power who had failed to protect them during the crisis. As the failed growing season of 1316 gave way to winter, European populations that had already endured nearly 2 years of starvation faced what seemed like an impossible challenge, surviving another season with virtually no food reserves and greatly weakened populations. The situation was so desperate that normal social rules had largely broken down across much of the continent. Traditional laws against theft and trespassing were ignored as hungry populations took whatever they could find to survive. The concept of private property, fundamental to feudal society, became meaningless when the alternative was death. Some communities attempted to organize collective survival efforts, pooling whatever resources remained and attempting to ration them carefully among all members. But these efforts were often undermined by desperation and mistrust. When everyone is starving, it becomes nearly impossible to maintain the cooperation necessary for group survival. The winter of 1316 to 1317 marked the absolute nadir of the Great Famine. By this point, the crisis had been ongoing for nearly 2 years, and those who were going to die from direct starvation largely already had. What remained were weakened, traumatized populations struggling to survive on the absolute minimum of resources while fighting off diseases that thrived among the malnourished. The agricultural system that had supported European civilization for centuries was in complete collapse. Fields lay fallow not because farmers chose not to plant them, but because there were no farmers left to do the work, no seed grain to plant, and no draft animals to pull the plows. The knowledge and expertise that had built medieval agriculture was being lost as experienced farmers died and younger generations never learned the necessary skills. As spring arrived in 1317, after nearly 2 years of unrelenting catastrophe, there were finally signs that the climate crisis might be easing. The rains, while still heavy in many regions, were no longer the constant torrential downpours that had characterized the previous seasons. For the first time since 1314, it seemed remotely possible that a successful harvest might be achieved. But the challenges facing European agriculture were now far more complex than simply weather, and the road to recovery would prove to be longer and more difficult than anyone could have imagined. The optimism that greeted the improving weather in 1317 was quickly tempered by harsh reality. While the climate was returning to more normal patterns, the agricultural infrastructure that had supported European civilization for centuries lay in complete ruins. The seed grain that would normally be planted had long since been consumed by starving populations who chose immediate survival over future harvests. This decision, while understandable and perhaps inevitable given the circumstances, created a cascading problem that would plague recovery efforts for years to come. Medieval agriculture operated on the principle of setting aside approximately 1/4 of each harvest as seed for the following year's planting. This seed grain was typically carefully protected and stored in special granaries, treated almost as sacred since it represented the community's future survival. But when people are literally starving to death, long-term planning becomes impossible. Families face the terrible choice between dying immediately or consuming their seed grain and gambling that somehow they would be able to obtain new seed before the next planting season. By 1317, the vast majority of Europe's seed grain reserves had been consumed. A bushel of seed grain was needed to produce approximately 4 bushels of wheat under normal conditions, but now communities across the continent found themselves with no seed to plant even if the weather cooperated. Few remaining seed supplies commanded astronomical prices that made them unaffordable for all but the wealthiest landowners. The shortage of draft animals created an equally serious problem. The oxen that had taken years to train and represented enormous investments of time and resources had been slaughtered for food during the worst months of the crisis. Horses, essential for both transportation and heavy agricultural work, had filled desperate stomachs months earlier. Even if farmers had seed to plant and adequate weather for growing, they had no way to prepare the fields properly without animal power. Training new draft animals was a process that took months or even years, requiring experienced tanners who knew how to break young oxen to the plow and teach horses to work in agricultural settings. This was skilled work that had traditionally been passed down from father to son through generations of farming families. But many of these experienced trainers had died during the famine, and their knowledge had died with them. Most critically, the human population that possessed the agricultural knowledge and physical strength to work the land had been devastated. Experienced farmers who had spent decades learning the intricacies of soil management, crop rotation, animal husbandry, and seasonal timing were dead, displaced, or too weakened by malnutrition to perform the heavy labor that agriculture required. An entire generation of agricultural expertise was being lost as older farmers died and younger people never had the opportunity to learn essential skills. The harvest of 1317 was indeed better than those of the previous two catastrophic years, but better was a relative term that provided little comfort to populations that had been pushed to the very edge of extinction. Crop yields were still far below normal levels, and the amounts produced were insufficient to feed the surviving population adequately. What the 1317 harvest did provide, however, was something that had been absent for over 2 years: hope. For the first time since the crisis began, people could see grain actually growing in the fields. The sight of green shoots pushing through the soil, however sparse and stunted they might be, represented the possibility that the nightmare might eventually end. Communities that had been making plans for their own extinction now began to cautiously consider the possibility of survival, though they remained acutely aware of how fragile their situation remained. The recovery process that began in 1317 was painfully slow and marked by numerous setbacks. Even with the improved harvest of that year, historians estimate that it would be another 5 years before food supplies in Europe returned to anything approaching normal levels. Europe did not fully recover from the Great Famine until 1322, a full 7 years after the crisis began. This extended recovery period reflected the complexity of rebuilding an agricultural system that had been completely shattered. The demographic catastrophe meant that there were fewer mouths to feed, which should have made recovery easier. But there were also dramatically fewer hands available to do the agricultural work necessary to produce food. The surviving population was weakened by years of malnutrition and often lacked the physical strength necessary for the demanding work of farming. The process of obtaining new seed grain became one of the most challenging aspects of recovery. With local supplies exhausted, communities had to seek seed from distant regions that had been less severely affected by the famine. This required long-distance trade networks that had been disrupted by the crisis, and it demanded payment in cash or goods that most communities simply didn't possess. The price of seed grain reflected these desperate circumstances. A bushel of wheat seed that might have cost a few shillings in 1314 now commanded prices that represented months of wages for surviving workers. Communities faced impossible choices. They could eat what little grain they could acquire to survive the immediate crisis, or they could save it for planting and risk starving before the next harvest could be gathered. The process of rebuilding livestock herds was even more challenging than obtaining seed grain. Cattle and sheep that had taken years to breed and raise had been destroyed in a matter of months during the worst years of the famine. The disease known as murrain, which had swept through European livestock populations during 1350–1317, had killed animals more effectively than human consumption. In some regions, livestock mortality reached 80%, leaving vast areas almost completely devoid of domestic animals. The recovery of livestock populations was complicated by the fact that the animals that survived the famine years were often weak, diseased, or genetically inferior specimens that had been spared slaughter only because they were too sickly to provide adequate meat. Breeding programs had to start essentially from scratch, using whatever animals could be obtained from distant regions or from the few local herds that had somehow survived intact. The absence of livestock created cascading problems throughout the agricultural system. Without oxen for plowing, farmers had to resort to human labor for tasks that had traditionally been performed by animal power. This was back-breaking work that required enormous amounts of physical effort from populations that were already weakened by years of malnutrition. Fields that should have been plowed deep had to be worked by hand with simple tools, resulting in inferior soil preparation and reduced crop yields. The shortage of animals also meant a severe reduction in the availability of fertilizer. Medieval agriculture depended heavily on animal manure to maintain soil fertility, and the absence of livestock meant that fields gradually became less productive even when adequate seed and labor were available. This created a vicious cycle where reduced fertility led to smaller harvests, which made it even more difficult to feed both humans and animals. Despite these overwhelming challenges, some communities managed to implement innovative survival strategies that helped them navigate the difficult recovery period. One of the most significant adaptations was the increased reliance on alternative food sources that had previously been considered emergency rations at best. Legumes, particularly beans and lentils, became crucial components of the post-famine diet. These crops had several advantages over traditional grains. They required less intensive cultivation, they could improve soil fertility through nitrogen fixation, and they provided protein levels that were essential for populations recovering from prolonged malnutrition. Dried legumes could also be stored for years without spoiling, creating food reserves that could help prevent future famines. The cultivation of root vegetables also expanded dramatically during the recovery period. Turnips, in particular, became an increasingly important crop because they could produce 4 times as much food per acre as grain crops. This extraordinary productivity made turnips essential during the population recovery that followed the famine. Unlike many crops, turnips could remain in the ground through mild frosts, providing a living storage system that required no special facilities. Medieval communities also began to make greater use of tree crops and wild foods that had previously been considered unsuitable for human consumption. Acorns, which had traditionally been fed only to pigs, were processed into flour that could be mixed with grain to make bread. The bark of certain trees, particularly elm and oak, was ground up and used as a food additive when grain supplies were insufficient. Apples and other tree fruits became more important parts of the medieval diet during the recovery period. These fruits had the advantage of growing on perennial plants that didn't require annual replanting, and they could be dried for long-term storage. Medieval apples were smaller and more tart than modern varieties, but they provided essential vitamins and minerals that helped prevent the malnutrition-related diseases that had been so common during the famine years. Cabbage emerged as another crucial survival food during the recovery period. This hardy vegetable could grow in poor soil and cold weather, making it ideal for the marginal conditions that characterize post-famine agriculture. Cabbage was also rich in vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy, a disease that had become common among malnourished populations. Perhaps most importantly, cabbage could be preserved through fermentation, creating sauerkraut that lasted for months and provided food during the hungry months of late winter and early spring. The regional variations in famine impact and recovery patterns revealed the complex ways that geography, politics, and social structures influenced survival during the crisis. These variations would have lasting consequences for European development, as some regions recovered much more quickly than others and were able to take advantage of new opportunities while their neighbours remained mired in post-famine difficulties. England, despite suffering severe losses during the famine years, had certain advantages that facilitated recovery. The country's island geography provided some protection from the political instability that characterized continental Europe during this period. England's relatively centralized government, while primitive by modern standards, was more effective than the fragmented political systems of the Holy Roman Empire or the constantly warring principalities of France. English records from the recovery period show that by 1318 there was what chroniclers described as a bountiful harvest, though this abundance was relative to the devastation of the previous years rather than to normal pre-famine production levels. The recovery in England was also aided by the country's extensive maritime trade networks, which allowed for the importation of grain and seed from regions that had been less severely affected by the famine. The English government's response to the crisis, while often inadequate, was more coordinated than efforts in many other regions. King Edward Roman II's administration implemented price controls that, while ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated an understanding that government intervention might be necessary during times of crisis. The failure of these price controls provided valuable lessons about the complexities of managing food distribution during emergencies. Scotland's experience during the famine was complicated by the ongoing wars with England, which added violence and military devastation to the already catastrophic effects of starvation. Scottish populations faced what historians call a perfect storm of disasters: crop failures, livestock mortality, English military raids, and internal political instability. The combination of famine and warfare created conditions that were arguably worse than those faced by any other European region. The Scottish Wars of Independence, which had been raging since 1296, continued throughout the famine years with devastating consequences for civilian populations. English armies deliberately targeted Scottish agricultural resources, burning crops and slaughtering livestock as part of their military strategy. This military devastation made it impossible for Scottish communities to implement the kind of coordinated recovery efforts that were attempted in other regions. The Scots' desperate search for food led to increased trading across the English border, creating a vicious cycle of violence that made recovery even more difficult for both sides. Starving Scots would cross into northern England seeking food and plunder, prompting English retaliation that devastated Scottish border regions even further. The people of Northumbria found themselves caught between the effects of the famine and constant Scottish raids, reducing them to eating dogs and horses and other unclean things as they struggled to survive both hunger and violence. The Scottish recovery was also hampered by the country's less developed trade networks and more fragmented political structure. Unlike England, which could coordinate relief efforts through royal administration, Scotland's clan-based system made it difficult to organise large-scale recovery programs. Individual clans might recover at different rates, leading to internal conflicts over resources that further slowed the overall recovery process. Ireland's experience during the Great Famine foreshadowed in many ways the more famous Irish potato famine of the 1840s. The island's population was heavily dependent on grain agriculture that was particularly vulnerable to the wet conditions of 1350–1317. Irish soil, which was often poorly drained to begin with, became completely waterlogged during the worst years of the crisis. Irish chroniclers recorded levels of mortality that were extreme even by the standards of the continental crisis. The Annals of Connacht described 1315 as a year of great famine and want throughout all Ireland, and subsequent entries documented continuing deaths from starvation and disease through 1318. The recovery in Ireland was slower than in England, partly due to the island's more limited trade connections and partly due to ongoing conflicts between Gaelic Irish and Anglo-Norman settlers. Social and political structures in Ireland also made recovery more difficult. The ongoing conflict between different ethnic and political groups created additional instability during a time when cooperation was essential for survival. Resources that should have been devoted to agricultural recovery were instead consumed by military campaigns and factional fighting. The Norman-controlled areas had better access to external trade networks, but they were also targets for raids by desperate Gaelic populations. Continental Europe showed similarly dramatic regional variations in both the severity of the crisis and the speed of recovery. The Low Countries, including modern-day Netherlands and Belgium, were among the most severely affected regions due to their low-lying geography and dependence on grain agriculture. The waterlogged conditions that destroyed crops in these areas persisted longer than in higher elevations, creating some of the most prolonged suffering in Europe. Flanders, one of medieval Europe's most prosperous and densely populated regions, experienced what contemporary chroniclers described as unprecedented mortality. The combination of high population density, dependence on grain imports, and severe local crop failures created conditions where even wealthy merchants and craftsmen faced starvation. The famous cloth-making cities of Flanders saw their populations decimated as both the raw materials for production and the food needed to sustain workers became unavailable. The recovery in Flanders was complicated by the region's dependence on international trade networks that had been disrupted by the crisis. The cloth industry, which had been the foundation of Flemish prosperity, could not recover until both raw material supplies and food security were restored. This created a complex recovery process where economic and agricultural restoration had to proceed simultaneously. France, despite being one of medieval Europe's largest and most populous kingdoms, struggled with regional famines that varied dramatically in severity depending on local conditions and political circumstances. Northern French regions that were dependent on grain agriculture suffered devastation comparable to England and the Low Countries. The royal chronicles described conditions in Normandy and Picardy as worse than any living man could remember. Southern French regions that had more diverse agricultural systems and access to Mediterranean trade routes experienced less severe shortages, though they were not entirely spared. The difference between northern and southern France during the famine years highlighted the importance of agricultural diversity and trade connections in surviving subsistence crises. The recovery in France was hampered by the country's fragmented political structure, which made coordinated relief efforts difficult to organize. While the French king had theoretical authority over the entire realm, the practical power of local nobles meant that recovery efforts varied dramatically from region to region. Some areas received effective support from their local lords, while others were left to fend for themselves. The German states presented an even more complex patchwork of famine experiences that reflected the highly fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Some German regions, particularly those along major river valleys like the Rhine and Danube, maintained better access to trade networks that could provide emergency food supplies. These rivers served as highways for grain transport from less affected regions. Other German areas, especially isolated mountain communities in regions like Bavaria and Austria, experienced mortality rates that may have exceeded even the worst affected areas of England and the Low Countries. These communities had few resources for importing food and were entirely dependent on local production that had failed completely. The recovery in the German states was complicated by the ongoing political conflicts within the Holy Roman Empire. The struggle between different claimants to the imperial throne meant that resources were diverted to military campaigns rather than famine relief. Some regions benefited from the protection and support of powerful local lords, while others were abandoned to their fate. Eastern Europe, including Poland and Hungary, generally experienced less severe famine conditions than Western regions, partly due to different agricultural systems and low population densities. However, these areas would later become crucial sources of grain imports that aided Western European recovery efforts. The grain trade from Eastern to Western Europe, which expanded significantly during the recovery period, represented one of the few positive economic developments to emerge from the crisis. The social and economic transformations that emerged from the Great Famine were as significant as the immediate demographic catastrophe. The traditional feudal system, based on mutual obligations between lords and peasants, had been severely damaged by the nobility's inability to protect their subjects from starvation. The authority of kings and nobles, previously considered divinely ordained and unquestionable, was fundamentally undermined by their demonstrated helplessness during the crisis. Peasant populations that survived the famine were no longer willing to accept the same conditions of servitude that had characterized pre-famine society. Having witnessed the complete breakdown of traditional social order, many peasants began to question why they should continue to provide labor and agricultural products to lords who had proven unable to fulfill their protective obligations. This shift in peasant attitudes had immediate practical consequences during the recovery period. Labor shortages created by the demographic catastrophe meant that surviving workers could demand better wages and working conditions for the first time in centuries. Lords who had previously been able to command peasant labor through feudal obligations now found themselves competing for workers in something approaching a free labor market. The changes in labor relations were particularly dramatic in England, where detailed records allow historians to track wage and price movements during the recovery period. Gregory Clark's analysis of English wage data suggests that the first year of the Great Famine was, in terms of real wages, the single worst year for wage laborers in recorded English history. However, the years immediately following the famine saw significant improvements in working conditions as labor scarcity drove up wages. The demographic transformation created by the famine had lasting effects on European social structure. With fewer people competing for available land and resources, survivors found themselves in a relatively better position than their ancestors had enjoyed for centuries. This shift in the balance between population and resources would have profound consequences for European development over the following centuries. The economic changes extended beyond simple labor relations to encompass fundamental shifts in how medieval society organized production and distribution. The failure of traditional feudal relationships meant that new forms of economic organization had to be developed. Market relationships became more important as communities could no longer rely on feudal obligations to ensure the production and distribution of essential goods. The monetary systems of medieval Europe were also affected by the demographic and economic changes that followed the famine. With fewer people competing for available resources, wages generally increased, but the supply of precious metals for coinage remained limited. This created inflationary pressures that complicated economic recovery efforts and contributed to the political instability that characterized the post-famine period. The agricultural innovations that emerged from the Great Famine represented one of the few clearly positive long-term consequences of the crisis. The complete breakdown of traditional farming systems forced communities to experiment with new approaches to agriculture that might be more resistant to climate disasters and capable of feeding populations more efficiently. Crop diversification became much more common in post-famine Europe as communities recognized the dangers of depending too heavily on single crops. Regions that had previously focused almost exclusively on wheat and barley began to cultivate a wider variety of grains, legumes, and vegetables. This diversification provided some protection against future crop failures since different crops responded differently to various weather conditions. The expansion of legume cultivation was particularly significant. Beans, lentils, and peas not only provided essential protein for recovering populations, but also improved soil fertility through nitrogen fixation. This natural fertilization was crucial during the recovery period when animal manure was scarce due to livestock losses. Root vegetable cultivation also expanded dramatically. Turnips, parsnips, and other root crops could produce more food per acre than traditional grains and could be stored through the winter without special preservation techniques. The development of more sophisticated root storage systems helped communities build food reserves that could prevent future famines. The development of better food storage and preservation techniques accelerated during the recovery period as communities recognized the critical importance of maintaining emergency food supplies. Traditional preservation methods like drying, salting, and smoking were refined and expanded. New techniques for fermentation were developed that could preserve vegetables through the winter months. Granary construction became a higher priority for post-famine communities. The traditional practice of storing grain in individual households was supplemented by community granaries that could maintain larger reserves and distribute food during emergencies. These communal storage systems represented a significant shift toward more collective approaches to food security. Water management systems also improved significantly in response to the flooding that had characterized the famine years. Communities invested in drainage systems, dikes, and other infrastructure designed to prevent the kind of waterlogging that had destroyed crops during 1350–1317. The Low Countries, in particular, developed sophisticated water management techniques that would serve them well in future centuries. The technological innovations that emerged during the recovery period were modest but significant in their cumulative impact. Agricultural tools became more sophisticated as communities invested in equipment that could improve productivity and reduce dependence on human labor. The development of better plows, harrows, and other farming implements helped make agriculture more efficient and productive. However, these technological improvements were limited by the economic constraints of the post-famine period. Communities that were struggling to rebuild their basic agricultural infrastructure had limited resources available for investing in new technologies. Most innovations were incremental improvements to existing techniques rather than revolutionary changes. The connection between the Great Famine and the later Black Death pandemic was not merely chronological but causal in important ways that historians are only now beginning to fully understand. The populations that survived the famine years were weakened, malnourished, and living in conditions that made them extremely vulnerable to disease when the plague arrived in Europe 30 years later. Modern scientific research has confirmed what medieval chroniclers suspected. The Great Famine created ideal conditions for the devastating mortality that characterized the Black Death. Populations, weakened by prolonged malnutrition, had compromised immune systems that were unable to fight off plague infection effectively. The demographic recovery that might have restored European populations to pre-famine levels was interrupted by the plague pandemic, creating a compound catastrophe that reshaped European civilization. Ice core data and other scientific evidence suggest that the climate problems that caused the Great Famine were part of a longer pattern of adverse weather conditions that persisted well beyond 1317. This means that European populations faced decades of marginal harvests and periodic food shortages that prevented full recovery from the initial famine crisis. The weakened state of post-famine populations made them particularly vulnerable to the respiratory diseases that would become so deadly during the Black Death. Malnutrition-related damage to the immune system, combined with overcrowded living conditions in urban areas where famine refugees had congregated, created perfect conditions for disease transmission. The social disruption caused by the Great Famine also contributed to the spread of plague when it arrived. Traditional community structures that might have provided support during health crises had been weakened or destroyed. The mobility of post-famine populations, as people moved in search of better opportunities, facilitated the rapid spread of disease across Europe. The psychological and cultural impacts of the Great Famine extended far beyond the immediate crisis years and continued to influence European society well into the modern period. Survivors carried trauma that influenced their behavior for the rest of their lives, and communities developed collective memories that shaped social attitudes for generations. The confident optimism that had characterized the High Middle Ages was permanently shattered by the experience of the Great Famine. The assumption that population growth and agricultural expansion would automatically lead to greater prosperity was replaced by a more cautious, pessimistic worldview that emphasized the fragility of human existence and the danger of overextending resources. This cultural transformation was reflected in art, literature, and religious thought of the post-famine period. The themes of death, suffering, and divine judgment became much more prominent in medieval culture. The concept of memento mori, the reminder that death could come at any moment, became central to medieval art and literature in ways that would have been foreign to pre-famine society. Folk tales and legends that emerged from the famine period continued to reflect the trauma of those years for centuries afterward. The story of Hansel and Gretel, with its themes of parental abandonment during times of scarcity and the fantasy of houses made of food, can be directly traced to the experiences of the Great Famine. The tale served as both entertainment and a way of processing collective trauma, allowing communities to discuss their fears about starvation and abandonment in a safe, fictional context. Similarly, numerous other European folk tales that involve themes of hunger, cannibalism, and survival during times of scarcity likely originated during the Great Famine period. These stories served as cultural memory banks, preserving important survival information while also providing emotional outlets for communities processing traumatic experiences. The religious implications of the Great Famine were profound and lasting, contributing to fundamental changes in European Christianity that would have consequences for centuries to come. For generations, the Catholic Church had taught that God rewarded the faithful with earthly blessings and punished sinners with suffering. But the famine struck good Christians and sinners alike, creating a crisis of faith that rippled through medieval society. The experience of watching devout Christians starve to death while seemingly wicked people sometimes survive challenged fundamental assumptions about divine justice and the relationship between earthly behavior and heavenly reward. These theological questions didn't have easy answers within the existing framework of medieval Christianity, leading many people to question religious teachings that had seemed unshakable just a few years earlier. Some religious leaders attempted to maintain traditional explanations by framing the famine as divine punishment for collective sin, calling for increased penance and devotion as a solution to the crisis. The Archbishop of Canterbury ordered special processions and prayers throughout England in an attempt to curry divine favor and end the famine through increased religious devotion. But these explanations rang increasingly hollow to populations that were watching their families waste away despite their prayers and good works. The failure of religious interventions to end the crisis undermined clerical authority and contributed to the growth of alternative religious movements that would challenge church orthodoxy in the later medieval period. The Black Death, when it arrived 30 years later, would complete the process of religious questioning that began during the Great Famine. The combination of mass starvation followed by pandemic disease created conditions where traditional religious explanations for suffering seemed completely inadequate, contributing to the rise of a new religious movement and, ultimately, to the religious reforms of the later medieval and early modern periods. The political consequences of the Great Famine continued to unfold throughout the 14th century, fundamentally altering the balance of power within European society. The weakening of traditional authority structures that began during the crisis years contributed to the political instability that characterized later medieval Europe. The inability of medieval governments to effectively respond to the famine crisis revealed the limitations of existing political systems. Kings and nobles who claimed to rule by divine right found their authority questioned when they proved helpless against natural disasters. The social contract that formed the basis of feudal society protection in exchange for service was broken when protection proved impossible to provide. The demographic changes caused by the famine also altered political relationships in fundamental ways. With fewer people available to work the land and fill armies, surviving populations found themselves in a stronger bargaining position relative to their rulers. This shift in the balance of power would contribute to the peasant revolts and political upheavals that characterized the later 14th century. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which began in 1337, was partly a consequence of the political weakening that resulted from the demographic and economic disruptions of the famine period. Rulers who might previously have focused on internal development instead turned to external conquest as a way of maintaining their authority and accessing new resources. The rise of new forms of political organization, including more powerful merchant guilds and urban governments, can also be traced to the social changes that emerged from the Great Famine. As traditional feudal relationships broke down, new forms of political authority emerged to fill the vacuum. Cities that had survived the famine better than rural areas found themselves with increased political influence. The military implications of the demographic catastrophe were also significant and long-lasting. The reduction in available manpower made it more difficult for medieval kingdoms to maintain large armies in the traditional manner, contributing to important changes in military tactics and organization that would shape European warfare for centuries. The traditional system of feudal military service, where nobles provided soldiers in exchange for land grants, became increasingly unworkable when there weren't enough people to fill both agricultural and military roles. This led to the rise of professional soldiers and mercenary companies that could provide military service without depleting the agricultural workforce. The scarcity of manpower also encouraged the development of new military technologies and tactics that could achieve victory with smaller numbers of soldiers. The increased use of longbows, crossbows, and early firearms during the later 14th century partly reflected the need to make individual soldiers more effective in combat. By the mid-1320s, approximately a decade after the worst years of the crisis, European society had achieved a partial recovery that was nevertheless fragile and incomplete. Food supplies had returned to adequate levels in most regions, though they remained vulnerable to disruption from bad weather or political instability. Population levels had stabilized, though at numbers significantly below pre-famine levels. This partial recovery created a deceptive sense of normalcy that masked the fundamental changes that had occurred in European society. While daily life for survivors might have seemed to return to something approaching pre-famine patterns, the underlying structures of medieval civilization had been permanently altered. Economic activity had resumed, though with new patterns and relationships that reflected the changed circumstances of post-famine society. Labor was scarcer and therefore more valuable, leading to wage increases that would have been unimaginable before the crisis. Trade networks had been re-established, but with different routes and partnerships that reflected the changed political and economic landscape. The agricultural recovery was real, but remained precarious. While food production had returned to levels that could support the reduced population, the farming systems that provided this food were different from those that had existed before the famine. The increased emphasis on crop diversification, root vegetables, and legumes represented significant changes in both agricultural practice and dietary patterns. This partial recovery would prove to be tragically temporary. The populations that had survived the Great Famine and begun to rebuild their lives had no way of knowing that even greater catastrophes lay ahead. The Black Death, when it arrived in 1347, would find European populations that were still weakened by the earlier crisis and vulnerable to new forms of disaster. The lessons of the Great Famine were not entirely lost on contemporary observers, but they were also not sufficient to prevent future catastrophes. Medieval society lacked the technological and organizational capabilities necessary to create truly effective safeguards against agricultural crises. The improvements in food storage, agricultural techniques, and emergency planning that emerged from the famine experience were significant but ultimately inadequate to prevent future disasters. The story of recovery from the Great Famine is thus both inspiring and tragic. It demonstrates the remarkable resilience of human communities in the face of catastrophic challenges, but it also reveals the limitations of medieval society's ability to learn from and adapt to crisis. The partial recovery of the 1320s and 1330s represented a triumph of human determination and ingenuity, but it also set the stage for even greater disasters that would follow. The experience of the Great Famine fundamentally changed European attitudes toward risk, security, and the future. The confident assumption that prosperity would continue indefinitely was replaced by a more cautious approach that emphasized the importance of maintaining reserves and preparing for potential disasters. However, these lessons would prove insufficient when tested by the even greater challenges of the Black Death pandemic. The true horror of the Great Famine can only be understood through the individual stories that emerge from the chronicles and records of those who lived through it. These personal accounts, preserved in monastery records, royal documents, and merchant ledgers, reveal the human face of a catastrophe so vast that it defies comprehension. Each story represents thousands of similar experiences that were never recorded, voices that were silenced by starvation, disease, and desperation. Contemporary chroniclers, despite their tendency to employ biblical imagery and religious interpretation, provide us with remarkably detailed accounts of specific incidents that occurred during the famine years. These writers were not distant observers, but direct witnesses to events that challenged everything they understood about their world. Their chronicles, while sometimes colored by religious doctrine, preserve the raw testimony of people who watched their civilization collapse around them. The Chronicle of Jean de Venette, a French Carmelite friar who lived through the entire crisis, provides one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the famine's impact on ordinary people. De Venette wrote with precision of someone who understood that he was documenting events of unprecedented importance. His chronicle describes the progression from initial concern about bad weather to complete social breakdown with a clarity that modern historians find invaluable. According to de Venette, the first signs of crisis appeared in the behavior of animals rather than humans. Domestic animals began acting strangely as early as 1314, with cattle and sheep showing signs of distress that experienced farmers had never seen before. Dogs and cats abandoned their homes in large numbers, apparently sensing some environmental change that humans had not yet recognized. This animal behavior, which would have been dismissed as superstition in normal times, was actually an early warning of the ecological disaster that was approaching. The transformation of human behavior followed a predictable but horrifying pattern that de Venette documented with clinical precision. Initially, communities responded to food shortages with traditional coping mechanisms, rationing, sharing resources, and turning to local authorities for help. But as the crisis deepened and these conventional responses proved inadequate, social bonds began to break down in ways that shocked even experienced chroniclers. De Venette recorded specific incidents that illustrate the complete breakdown of normal social relationships. He described a market day in Rouen during the autumn of 1315 when a baker's cart carrying precious bread was overturned by a desperate crowd. The resulting riot left several people dead and the bread trampled into the mud, wasted and inedible. The incident was shocking not only because of the violence involved, but because it represented the collapse of the orderly market relationships that had governed food distribution for centuries. The Chronicle of the Annales Gandenses, written by monks in Ghent, provides equally disturbing accounts of the famine's impact on family relationships. The monks documented cases of parents abandoning children not out of cruelty, but out of desperate hope that someone else might be able to provide care they could no longer give. These incidents were so common in the Low Countries that special terminology developed to describe them. Children found abandoned near monasteries were called famine foundlings, and religious institutions struggled to care for the overwhelming numbers of these desperate cases. One particular case recorded in the Annales Gandenses has become emblematic of the famine's impact on family life. A merchant named Willem van der Meer brought his 3 young children to the gates of St. Bavo's Abbey in Ghent during the winter of 1316. Van der Meer, who had lost his business and property during the crisis, could no longer feed his family. Rather than watch his children starve, he left them at the monastery with a note explaining that he hoped God would provide for them better than he could. The monks took in the children, but Van der Meer was found dead in the nearby woods just days later, apparently having committed suicide from grief and despair. The English chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker documented similar incidents in his native Oxfordshire, describing how entire villages became ghost towns as their populations either died or fled in search of food. Le Baker's chronicle includes detailed descriptions of abandoned homesteads where personal belongings remained exactly as their owners had left them, creating eerie reminders of the lives that had been destroyed by the crisis. One of Lebeco's most haunting accounts describes his visit to the village of Cuxham in 1316, where he found houses standing empty with doors left open and tools scattered in the fields where they had been dropped by farmers too weak to continue working. The village church still contained the personal belongings of families who had simply walked away from their homes when they could no longer survive there. Years later, when conditions improved, no one returned to reclaim these possessions. The entire community had been erased by the famine. The transformation of religious attitudes during the famine years is perhaps most clearly documented in the personal accounts of clergy who struggled to maintain their faith while witnessing unprecedented suffering. Brother Thomas of Eccleston, a Franciscan monk in Canterbury, kept a detailed journal throughout the crisis that reveals the profound spiritual challenges faced by religious communities. Brother Thomas wrote of his own crisis of faith as he watched devout Christians die of starvation while seemingly wicked people sometimes survived. His journal entries from late 1315 reveal a man struggling to reconcile his religious training with the reality of what he was witnessing. "How can we say that God rewards the righteous," he wrote, "when I have buried more good Christians this month than in all the previous years of my service? The children cry for bread, and we have none to give them. Where is the divine providence that should protect the innocent?" The journal of Brother Thomas also provides detailed accounts of the practical challenges faced by religious institutions during the crisis. Monasteries, which had traditionally served as sources of charity and support for surrounding communities, found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of need. The monks of Canterbury were forced to make impossible choices about who to help and who to turn away, decisions that violated their fundamental religious principles but were necessary for the survival of their institution. The records of royal households provide another unique perspective on the famine's impact, revealing how even the wealthiest and most powerful members of society were affected by the crisis. The household accounts of King Edward Roman II of England show dramatic changes in royal consumption patterns as the famine progressed. Where the royal kitchen had previously prepared elaborate meals with multiple courses, by 1316 even the king was eating simple bread and porridge on many days. Perhaps most remarkably, the royal accounts document the famous incident at St. Albans where King Edward Roman II and his entire household struggled to find adequate food. The incident was not simply a matter of convenience, but represented a genuine shortage that affected even the highest levels of society. The king's treasurer, Walter de Norwich, recorded that the royal party was forced to eat coarse bread mixed with bean flour and that even this inferior food was difficult to obtain. The account books of wealthy merchants provide additional evidence of how the crisis affected different social classes. The records of Giovanni Villani, a Florentine banker with extensive business interests in northern Europe, show how the famine disrupted trade networks that had functioned reliably for centuries. Villani's correspondence with his agents in Bruges, London, and Paris documents the complete breakdown of normal commercial relationships as communities turned inward to focus on immediate survival. Villana's letters from this period reveal the human cost of economic disruption in remarkably personal terms. He wrote of business partners who had died of starvation, of trading agreements that became meaningless when neither party could fulfill their obligations, and of entire commercial networks that simply ceased to function. A letter from his London agent, dated March 1316, describes such scarcity and death that men dare not travel the roads, and those who do arrive bring tales of horror that make trade impossible. The cultural transformations that emerged from the Great Famine were as profound as the immediate demographic catastrophe, fundamentally altering European art, literature, music, and popular culture in ways that would persist for centuries. The confident optimism that had characterized high medieval culture was permanently shattered, replaced by darker themes that reflected the trauma of mass starvation and social collapse. Medieval art before the famine had typically emphasized themes of divine glory, human dignity, and the beauty of creation. Religious art, which dominated medieval culture, focused on the triumphant aspects of Christianity, the resurrection, the glory of heaven, and the ultimate victory of good over evil. But art created during and after the famine years showed a marked shift toward darker, more somber themes that reflected the harsh realities that artists and their audiences had experienced. The emergence of memento mori as a central theme in medieval art can be directly traced to the famine years. These artistic reminders of death and the fragility of human existence became increasingly common in churches, manuscripts, and secular art. Where early medieval art had portrayed death as a distant concern or as a gateway to heavenly reward, Post-famine art presented death as an immediate, ever-present reality that could strike anyone at any time. The famous Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death artistic tradition, which became widespread in the 14th century, emerged directly from the cultural trauma of the Great Famine and the later Black Death. These artistic representations showed death as a skeletal figure leading people from all walks of life in a macabre dance, emphasizing that starvation and disease made no distinction between rich and poor, powerful and powerless. One of the earliest examples of this new artistic sensibility can be found in the illuminated manuscripts produced at the Abbey of St. Denis near Paris during the 1320s. These manuscripts, which had previously featured bright colors and optimistic religious imagery, began to incorporate much darker themes. Scenes of the Last Judgment became more prominent, and depictions of hell became more detailed and terrifying. The artists were clearly responding to recent experiences that had made divine wrath seem more real and immediate than divine mercy. The transformation of popular literature during the post-famine period was equally dramatic. Folk tales and stories that had previously emphasized heroic adventures and romantic love began to incorporate themes of survival, hunger, and social breakdown. The story of Hansel and Gretel, which became widespread during this period, can be directly traced to the experiences of families who had been forced to abandon their children during the famine years. The brothers Grimm, who collected this tale centuries later, may not have realized that they were preserving a cultural memory of one of Europe's darkest periods. But the story's central themes, parental abandonment during times of scarcity, children forced to fend for themselves in a hostile world, and the fantasy of houses made of food clearly reflect the traumatic experiences of the Great Famine. The gingerbread house represents the impossible dream of abundant food that haunted survivors for generations. Similarly, the proliferation of stories about cannibalistic witches and monsters during this period reflects the reality of human flesh consumption that had occurred during the worst years of the crisis. Tales like that of the witch in Hansel and Gretel, who fattens children before eating them, served as both entertainment and as ways for communities to process the traumatic memories of behaviors that violated fundamental human taboos. The musical traditions of medieval Europe were also profoundly affected by the famine experience. Sacred music, which had dominated medieval musical culture, began to incorporate more somber tones and darker themes. The confident, triumphant Gregorian chant traditions that had characterized earlier periods gave way to more mournful compositions that reflected the spiritual crisis brought on by mass suffering. Secular music showed even more dramatic changes, with the emergence of new song forms that dealt explicitly with themes of hunger, death, and social upheaval. Folk ballads that emerged from the famine period often dealt with the breakdown of traditional social relationships and the struggle for survival during times of scarcity. These songs served as both entertainment and as ways for communities to preserve and process their collective memories of the crisis. One example of this new musical tradition is the ballad The Hungry Time, which was first recorded in England during the 1320s, but which almost certainly originated during the famine years themselves. The ballad tells the story of a noble lord who is reduced to begging for bread from his former servants, illustrating the complete reversal of social relationships that had occurred during the crisis. The song's refrain, "When hunger rules, all bonds are broken," became a popular saying that persisted in English folk culture for centuries. Technological and agricultural innovations that emerged from the Great Famine represented some of the few positive long-term consequences of the crisis. The complete breakdown of traditional farming systems forced communities to experiment with new approaches that might be more resistant to climate disasters and more efficient in their use of available resources. The development of improved food preservation techniques accelerated dramatically during the recovery period as communities recognized the critical importance of maintaining emergency food supplies. Traditional methods of drying, salting, and smoking were refined and expanded to handle larger quantities of food more effectively. New techniques for fermentation were developed that could preserve vegetables through the winter months, providing essential nutrition during the hungry period between the exhaustion of stored grain and the arrival of fresh crops. The construction of community granaries became a much higher priority for post-famine communities. Before the crisis, most food storage had been handled by individual households, with only the wealthy maintaining significant reserves. But the famine had demonstrated the vulnerability of this decentralized system, leading to the development of communal storage facilities that could maintain larger reserves and distribute food during emergencies. These community granaries represented a significant shift toward more collective approaches to food security. They required cooperation and trust between community members who had to contribute to common stores and accept common management of essential resources. The social institutions that developed around these granaries would have lasting impacts on European political and economic development. Water management systems also improved significantly in response to the flooding that had characterized the famine years. Communities invested heavily in drainage systems, dikes, and other infrastructure designed to prevent the kind of waterlogging that had destroyed crops during 1350–1317. The Low Countries, in particular, developed sophisticated water management techniques that would serve them well for centuries to come. The famous Dutch polders, which allowed the cultivation of land below sea level, were first developed during the post-famine period as communities sought to expand the amount of land available for agriculture. These projects required unprecedented levels of cooperation and technological innovation, but they also provided valuable agricultural land that helped ensure food security for future generations. Agricultural diversification became much more common in post-famine Europe as communities recognized the dangers of depending too heavily on single crops. Regions that had previously focused almost exclusively on wheat and barley began to cultivate a wider variety of grains, legumes, and vegetables. This diversification provided some protection against future crop failures, since different crops responded differently to various weather conditions. The expansion of legume cultivation was particularly significant for both nutritional and agricultural reasons. Beans, lentils, and peas not only provided essential protein for recovering populations but also improved soil fertility through nitrogen fixation. This natural fertilization was crucial during the recovery period when animal manure was scarce due to livestock losses. Medieval farmers discovered that alternating legume crops with grains could actually improve soil productivity over time, leading to the development of more sophisticated crop rotation systems. These innovations would eventually contribute to the agricultural revolution of later centuries, but their origins can be traced directly to the desperate experimentation that occurred during the Great Famine recovery. Root vegetable cultivation also expanded dramatically during this period. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and other root crops could produce more food per acre than traditional grains and could be stored through the winter without special preservation techniques. The development of root cellars and other storage systems allowed communities to maintain fresh food supplies throughout the year. The cultivation of turnips became particularly important because they could produce up to 4 times as much food per acre as grain crops. This extraordinary productivity made turnips essential during the demographic recovery that followed the famine. Turnips could also be left in the ground through mild frosts, providing a living storage system that required no special facilities. The expanded cultivation of turnips would later play a crucial role in supporting the population growth of early modern Europe. The connection between the Great Famine and the Black Death pandemic that struck Europe 30 years later has become increasingly clear through modern scientific research. The relationship between these two catastrophes was not merely chronological but causal in ways that medieval observers suspected but could not prove. Recent scientific studies using ice core data, tree rain analysis, and archaeological evidence have confirmed that the climate problems that caused the Great Famine were part of a much longer pattern of adverse weather conditions. The cooling trend that began in the early 14th century continued for decades, creating recurring food crises that prevented European populations from fully recovering from the initial famine. This prolonged period of marginal harvests and periodic food shortages meant that European populations remained in a weakened state throughout the first half of the 14th century. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, it struck populations that had been malnourished and vulnerable for an entire generation. The compound effect of prolonged nutritional stress followed by pandemic disease created mortality rates that were unprecedented in European history. The scientific evidence for this connection comes from multiple sources that converge on the same conclusion. Ice core data from Greenland shows that the climatic conditions that caused the Great Famine persisted with varying intensity throughout the period from 1315 to 1350. Tree ring data from across Europe confirms that growing conditions remained marginal for most of this period, with only brief intervals of normal weather. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries provides additional confirmation of the connection between the famine and plague. Skeletal remains from the pre-plague period show clear signs of malnutrition-related stress, including stunted growth, bone deformities, and evidence of recurring disease. These findings suggest that European populations were already in a severely compromised state when the Black Death arrived. Modern medical research has also clarified the biological mechanisms by which prolonged malnutrition increases vulnerability to infectious disease. Protein energy malnutrition, which was widespread during the Great Famine, compromises the immune system in ways that make individuals much more susceptible to bacterial and viral infections. The specific type of malnutrition that characterized the famine years would have made European populations particularly vulnerable to the pneumonic form of plague that was responsible for much of the Black Death's mortality. The demographic data also supports the connection between famine and plague. Regions that had been most severely affected by the Great Famine also showed the highest mortality rates during the Black Death. England, northern France, and the Low Countries, which had experienced some of the worst famine conditions, also suffered the most devastating plague mortality. This correlation suggests that the earlier crisis had created conditions that made the later pandemic much more deadly. The social disruption caused by the Great Famine also contributed to the rapid spread of plague when it arrived. Traditional community structures that might have provided support during health crises had been weakened or destroyed by the earlier catastrophe. The mobility of post-famine populations, as people moved in search of better opportunities, facilitated the rapid transmission of disease across Europe. Urban areas that had served as refuges for rural populations during the famine years had become overcrowded and unsanitary, creating ideal conditions for disease transmission. The concentration of malnourished populations in cities made these areas particularly vulnerable when the plague arrived. Many of the urban centers that had grown during the famine recovery period became death traps during the Black Death. The psychological and cultural impact of experiencing 2 consecutive catastrophes within a single generation was profound and lasting. Populations that had survived the Great Famine and begun to rebuild their lives found themselves facing an even more devastating crisis just as they were beginning to recover. This sequence of disasters fundamentally altered European attitudes toward risk, security, and the future. The compound trauma of famine followed by plague created a cultural pessimism that would characterize European society for centuries. The confident assumption that human progress was possible and that the future would be better than the past was replaced by a much more cautious worldview that emphasized the fragility of human existence and the danger of placing too much trust in earthly prosperity. This cultural transformation was reflected in the art, literature, and religious thought of the post-plague period. The themes that had emerged during the Great Famine, death, suffering, and divine judgment became even more prominent after the Black Death. The combination of these 2 disasters created a cultural preoccupation with mortality that would influence European thought well into the modern period. The economic consequences of the famine-plague sequence were equally profound. The demographic collapse caused by these consecutive disasters fundamentally altered the relationship between population and resources in medieval Europe. For the first time in centuries, survivors found themselves in a world where labor was scarce and land was abundant. This shift would drive economic and social changes that would ultimately contribute to the end of the medieval period. The labor shortages created by the demographic catastrophe led to wage increases and improved working conditions that would have been unimaginable before the crisis. Surviving workers found themselves in a position to demand better treatment from employers who desperately needed their services. This shift in the balance of power between workers and employers would contribute to the social upheavals that characterized the later 14th century. The agricultural innovations that had emerged from the Great Famine proved to be particularly valuable during the post-plague recovery. The crop diversification, improved food storage, and water management systems that had been developed during the famine years helped surviving communities recover more quickly from the plague pandemic. Without these innovations, the demographic recovery from the Black Death might have taken much longer. The religious implications of experiencing consecutive catastrophes were equally significant. The crisis of faith that had begun during the Great Famine was completed by the Black Death. Traditional religious explanations for suffering seemed completely inadequate when applied to the unprecedented mortality of the mid-14th century. The result was a fundamental questioning of religious authority that would contribute to the religious reforms of the later medieval period. The emergence of new religious movements during the post-plague period can be directly traced to the spiritual crisis created by the famine-plague sequence. Movements like the Flagellants, who practiced extreme forms of penance in response to the disasters, represented attempts to understand and respond to catastrophes that seemed to exceed human comprehension. Similarly, the increased emphasis on mystical religious experience during the later medieval period reflected a turn away from institutional Christianity toward more personal forms of spirituality. The institutional church had failed to prevent or adequately explain the disasters of the mid-14th century, leading many people to seek alternative forms of religious expression. The political consequences of the famine plague sequence continued to unfold throughout the later medieval period. The weakening of traditional authority structures that had begun during the Great Famine was completed by the Black Death. Kings and nobles who had already seen their authority questioned during the famine found it even more difficult to maintain control over populations that had been further reduced and traumatized by plague. The peasant rebellions that characterized the later 14th century, including the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and similar uprisings across continental Europe, can be directly traced to the social changes initiated by the Great Famine and accelerated by the Black Death. Populations that had experienced the complete breakdown of traditional social order during these crises were no longer willing to accept the same conditions of subordination that had characterized pre-crisis society. The rise of new forms of political organization during the later medieval period also reflected the changes initiated by these disasters. Urban governments gained power relative to rural nobility, partly because cities had often managed the crises more effectively than feudal lords. Merchant classes that had survived the disasters found themselves in positions of increased influence and authority. The technological innovations that had emerged during the Great Famine were refined and expanded during the post-plague period. The necessity of maintaining smaller populations more efficiently drove continued improvements in agricultural techniques, food preservation, and manufacturing. These technological developments would eventually contribute to the economic expansion of the early modern period. The international trade networks that had been disrupted during the Great Famine and then further damaged by the Black Death were eventually rebuilt, but with different patterns and relationships. The demographic changes caused by these disasters altered the relative importance of different regions and cities, creating new centers of commerce and industry. By the late 14th century, the compound effects of the Great Famine and Black Death had fundamentally transformed European civilization. The confident, expanding society of the high medieval period had been replaced by a more cautious, defensive culture that was acutely aware of the fragility of human achievement. This transformation would influence European development for centuries to come. The lessons learned from these consecutive disasters would eventually contribute to important innovations in government, economics, and technology. The need for more effective responses to crises led to the development of more sophisticated administrative systems, better public health measures, and improved agricultural techniques. However, these advances came at the cost of enormous human suffering and the destruction of medieval society as it had previously existed. The cultural memory of the Great Famine and Black Death would persist in European consciousness for centuries, influencing everything from artistic expression to political philosophy. The knowledge that prosperity could disappear overnight and that entire civilizations could collapse created a cautious pragmatism that would characterize European thought well into the modern period. The scientific study of these medieval disasters continues to provide valuable insights for modern society. The mechanisms by which climate change, social disruption, and disease interact to create compound catastrophes remain relevant as we face our own environmental and social challenges. The Great Famine and Black Death demonstrate both the vulnerability of human societies to environmental change and the remarkable resilience that allows communities to survive and eventually recover from even the most devastating disasters. By the 1350s, as Europe emerged from the compound catastrophe of the Great Famine and the Black Death, a world had ended. Not just any world, but the medieval world itself, a civilization that had existed for nearly 1,000 years, with its distinctive social structures, economic systems, and cultural assumptions. The Great Famine of 1350–1317 had not merely killed millions of people and destroyed countless communities. It had fundamentally altered the trajectory of European civilization, marking the beginning of the end of the medieval period and setting in motion changes that would ultimately lead to the modern world. To truly understand the magnitude of this transformation, we must first examine the individual human stories that emerge from the darkness of these years. These are not the tales of kings and nobles that typically fill history books, but the testimonies of ordinary people who faced unimaginable hardship with courage, dignity, and remarkable resilience. Their voices, preserved in chronicles, letters, and legal documents, reveal the human dimension of a catastrophe so vast that numbers alone cannot capture its true meaning. Brother Thomas of Eccleston, a Franciscan monk in Canterbury, kept a detailed journal throughout the crisis that provides one of the most intimate accounts of the famine's impact on individual lives. His entries from the winter of 1315 reveal a man struggling not just with physical hardship, but with a profound crisis of faith that challenged everything he had been taught about divine providence and justice. "Today came to our gates a woman with 3 small children," Brother Thomas wrote in December 1315. She had walked from Rye carrying the youngest, who could barely lift his head. The woman's eyes, I shall never forget her eyes. They held such emptiness, as if her soul had already departed, though her body still moved. She asked for nothing, only stood there holding her children, waiting. We gave what we could, some broth, a bit of bread, but I know it was not enough. I know they will not survive another fortnight. The journal continues with similar entries throughout the winter months, each one documenting the arrival of desperate people seeking help, but the monastery could barely provide. Brother Thomas's faith, once unshakable, began to crumble as he witnessed good Christians dying while the wicked sometimes survived. "How can we say that God rewards the righteous?" he wrote, "when I have buried more innocent children this month than in all the previous years of my service combined?" The chronicle of Jean de Venette, a French Carmelite friar who witnessed the entire crisis firsthand, provides equally haunting accounts of individual suffering. De Venette documented the transformation of ordinary people under the pressure of starvation, describing how neighbors who had lived peacefully together for generations turned against each other when food became scarce. One of De Venette's most disturbing accounts describes a market day in Rouen during the autumn of 1315, when a baker's cart carrying precious bread was overturned by a desperate crowd. "The people fell upon the scattered loaves like wild animals," he wrote. "Men and women I had known since childhood, good Christians all, fought with their bare hands over crusts of bread. Blood was spilled over crumbs. When the dust settled, several lay dead, and the precious bread was trampled into the mud, inedible and wasted. This is what hunger does to the human soul. It strips away all that makes us civilized, and leaves only the animal desire to survive." The royal household accounts of King Edward Roman II of England provide a unique perspective on how even the most powerful members of society were affected by the crisis. These detailed records show the dramatic changes in royal consumption patterns as the famine progressed, revealing a king who went from feasting on elaborate multi-course meals to struggling to find basic sustenance. The famous incident at St. Albans in August 1315, where King Edward Roman II and his entire household struggled to find adequate food, is documented in painful detail in the royal treasurer's accounts. Walter de Norwich recorded that the royal party was forced to eat coarse bread mixed with bean flour, and that even this inferior food was difficult to obtain. His Majesty's cook wept openly, de Norwich wrote, for never in his years of service had he been unable to provide proper sustenance for the King of England. But perhaps the most heartbreaking accounts come from ordinary families caught in the disaster. The Annals Gandenses, written by monks in Ghent, preserve the story of Willem van der Meer, a merchant who brought his 3 young children to the gates of St. Bavur's Abbey during the winter of 1316. Van der Meer, who had lost his business and property during the crisis, could no longer feed his family. "I have failed them," he told the monks as he left his children at the abbey gates. "I have failed as a father, as a man, as a Christian. These children deserve better than I can give them. Perhaps God will provide for them through your hands, since he has chosen not to provide through mine." The note Van der Meer left with his children reads simply, "Their names are Pieter, Margarita, and little Jan. They are good children. They do not deserve this fate. Please remember them in your prayers, and remember the father who loved them more than his own life." Van der Meer was found dead in the nearby woods just days later, apparently having taken his own life from grief and despair. The transformation of family relationships under the pressure of starvation is documented in numerous contemporary sources. The Chronicle of Lanercost describes cases of parents abandoning children not out of cruelty, but out of desperate hope that someone else might be able to provide care they could no longer give. These incidents were so common that special terminology developed to describe them. Children found abandoned near monasteries were called famine foundlings, and religious institutions struggled to care for the overwhelming numbers of these desperate cases. One particularly tragic case involved the family from Yorkshire whose story was preserved in the records of Fountains Abbey. Margaret de Thornton, a widow with 4 young children, brought them to the abbey in the spring of 1316. She explained to the monks that she had not eaten in 5 days, having given all her remaining food to her children. "I can no longer stand upright," she told them. "I can no longer work to feed them. If I keep them with me, we will all die together. If I leave them with you, perhaps some will live." The abbey records show that Margaret walked away that day and was never seen again. 2 of her children survived to adulthood, but the other 2 died within weeks of their arrival. The scientific understanding of what caused the Great Famine has advanced dramatically in recent decades, revealing a complex interplay of climatic, volcanic, and oceanic factors that created the perfect storm of conditions leading to this catastrophe. Modern climate research has shown that the famine was not simply the result of a few bad weather years, but rather was part of a much larger climatic shift that marked the beginning of what scientists call the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age, which lasted from approximately 1300 to 1850, represents one of the most significant climate events of the past millennium. This prolonged period of cooling affected not just Europe but regions around the world, causing crop failures, famines, social upheaval, and political instability on a global scale. The Great Famine represents the earliest and most devastating European manifestation of this climate shift, serving as a harbinger of centuries of marginal growing conditions and periodic food crises. Recent groundbreaking research by Francois Lapointe and Raymond Bradley of the University of Massachusetts Amherst has revealed the paradoxical trigger for the Little Ice Age, an unusually warm period in the late 13th and early 14th centuries that disrupted ocean circulation patterns in the North Atlantic. Their analysis of marine sediment cores spanning 3,000 years of climate history revealed that exceptionally warm conditions triggered a sudden and dramatic shift in ocean circulation patterns within just 20 years. The North Atlantic Current, which carries warm water northward from the tropics and helps maintain Europe's relatively mild climate, underwent a significant weakening during this period. This disruption in the oceanic heat transport system caused a rapid transition from very warm conditions to unprecedented cold, creating the climatic conditions that would persist throughout the Little Ice Age and cause the Great Famine. The scientific evidence for this dramatic climate shift comes from multiple independent sources that all converge on the same conclusion. Ice core data from Greenland provides detailed records of temperature and precipitation patterns going back thousands of years, showing the precise timing and magnitude of the climate change. These ice cores contain annual layers that can be read like tree rings, providing year-by-year records of climate conditions. The data reveals that the period from 1315 to 1320 experienced some of the most extreme weather conditions of the entire millennium, with temperatures dropping rapidly and precipitation patterns becoming increasingly erratic. Tree ring data from across Europe and North America confirms the timing and severity of the climate shift. Oak trees in England, which had grown steadily during the medieval warm period, showed dramatic reductions in growth beginning around 1315. Pine forests in Scandinavia exhibit similar patterns, with growth rings becoming progressively narrower as temperatures dropped and growing seasons shortened. Across continental Europe, various tree species all show growth patterns consistent with dramatically cooler and wetter conditions beginning around 1315. The tree ring evidence is particularly valuable because it provides precise annual dating and can reveal regional variations in climate impacts. The data shows that northern and western Europe were most severely affected by the climate shift, while southern and eastern regions experienced less dramatic changes. This pattern matches the historical records of famine severity, providing scientific confirmation of the regional variations documented by medieval chroniclers. Marine sediment cores from the North Atlantic reveal changes in ocean circulation patterns that help explain the mechanisms behind the climate change. These deep-sea records, extracted from locations across the North Atlantic, show evidence of significant alterations in the strength and direction of ocean currents during the early 14th century. The sediment cores contain microscopic fossils of marine organisms that can reveal water temperatures and circulation patterns from centuries past. The sediment evidence shows that the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, a massive system of ocean currents that includes the Gulf Stream, underwent a significant weakening during the early 14th century. This circulation system is crucial for transporting heat from the tropics to northern regions, and its disruption would have had profound impacts on European climate. Volcanic activity played a crucial and devastating role in causing and extending the Little Ice Age. The period from 1250 to 1350 witnessed a series of massive volcanic eruptions that injected enormous quantities of ash and sulfur compounds into the stratosphere, where they remained for years, reflecting incoming solar radiation back into space and contributing to global cooling. The eruption of Mount Samalas in Indonesia in 1257 was one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the past millennium, and may have been particularly important in initiating the climate shift that led to the Great Famine. This eruption was so massive that it created what scientists call a volcanic winter, with global temperatures dropping by as much as 2 degrees C for several years after the eruption. The cooling effect was felt worldwide, with ice cores from both poles showing evidence of the volcanic ash and sulfur compounds that blocked incoming solar radiation. But the 1257 Samalas eruption was only the beginning. Between 1275 and 1300, at least 3 more major eruptions occurred, including eruptions in Iceland and Indonesia that further contributed to the cooling trend. Each eruption added more particulates to the atmosphere, creating a cumulative cooling effect that persisted for decades. By the time of the Great Famine, the atmosphere contained unprecedented levels of volcanic debris that continued to block solar radiation and suppress global temperatures. Recent scientific analysis has identified the specific volcanic eruptions that contributed to the Little Ice Age with remarkable precision. The eruptions of 1275, 1284, 1285, and 1316 all show up clearly in ice core records from both Greenland and Antarctica, providing a global picture of volcanic cooling that matches the timing of the Great Famine perfectly. The 1316 eruption occurred during the height of the famine, adding additional climatic stress to populations already struggling with multiple years of crop failures. Solar variability provides another crucial piece of the scientific puzzle. Multiple periods of reduced solar activity occurred during the Little Ice Age, including the Wolf minimum 12-1350, which encompassed the entire period of the Great Famine. Solar minimums are characterized by reduced sunspot activity and lower solar output, contributing to global cooling. The Wolf minimum began shortly before the Great Famine and continued throughout the crisis, adding another layer of cooling to the volcanic and oceanic effects. Modern satellite measurements have confirmed that solar output varies significantly over decades and centuries, with variations of up to 0.25% in total solar irradiance. While this may seem small, such variations can have significant impacts on global climate, particularly when combined with other cooling factors like volcanic eruptions and oceanic circulation changes. The combination of reduced solar output, volcanic cooling, and oceanic circulation disruption created a perfect storm of climate factors that made the Great Famine inevitable. The agricultural revolution that had occurred during the medieval warm period was directly dependent on the favorable climatic conditions that characterized that era. The 3-field crop rotation system, the expansion of legume cultivation, the development of a heavy plough, and the transition from oxen to horses for agricultural work had all been made possible by the longer growing seasons and more reliable weather patterns that characterized the warm period. During the medieval warm period, which lasted from approximately 950 to 1250 CE, temperatures were comparable to or even slightly warmer than modern levels. This warming supported agricultural expansion into marginally productive lands that had never before supported significant farming. The Scottish Highlands, previously considered unsuitable for agriculture, began producing grain crops. Vineyards flourished in England, producing wine that competed with French varieties. The tree line moved higher up mountainsides as temperatures warmed, opening vast new areas for human settlement. The population explosion that characterized the High Middle Ages was directly dependent on these favorable climatic conditions. Europe's population nearly tripled between 1000 and 1300 CE, growing from roughly 35 million to over 80 million people. This demographic boom was supported by agricultural innovations that were optimized for the warm, stable climate of the medieval warm period. When the climate began to shift in the early 14th century, these agricultural innovations, which had seemed so successful during the warm period, suddenly became inadequate to deal with the new conditions. The agricultural system that had supported Europe's demographic expansion was designed for the climate of the medieval warm period, not for the cold, wet conditions that would characterize the Little Ice Age. The demographic consequences of the Great Famine were unprecedented in scope and duration, creating changes in European population structure that persisted for centuries. Modern demographic analysis, using techniques not available to earlier historians, reveals that the famine killed between 10 and 25% of the population in the most severely affected regions, with some areas experiencing even higher mortality rates. The mortality was not evenly distributed across society. Children were particularly vulnerable, with some regions experiencing child mortality rates approaching 50% during the worst years of the famine. Elderly populations, already fragile due to age-related health issues, were among the first casualties of the crisis. Pregnant women faced impossible biological demands, with their bodies unable to support both their own survival and that of their unborn children. But the demographic impact extended far beyond the immediate death toll. The Great Famine created what demographers call a demographic scar, a lasting disruption in population structure that affected birth rates, marriage patterns, and family formation for generations. Survivors of the famine were more likely to delay marriage, have fewer children, and exhibit greater caution about family formation throughout their lives. The psychological trauma of experiencing mass starvation had profound and lasting effects on reproductive behavior. People who had lived through the famine years developed what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including heightened anxiety about food security, increased caution about the future, and a tendency to postpone major life decisions like marriage and childbearing until they felt more secure about the circumstances. These behavioral changes had important consequences for European demographic recovery that persisted for decades. Unlike some famines, where populations recover quickly once food supplies are restored, the Great Famine created lasting changes in fertility patterns that slowed population growth for generations. European population levels did not return to pre-famine numbers until well into the 15th century, and in some regions, full demographic recovery took even longer. The Irish experience during the Great Famine of the 1840s provides an illuminating parallel to the medieval demographic patterns. Ireland's population fell from 8.4 million in 1844 to 6.6 million by 1851, but the population continued to decline for decades afterward, reaching just half its pre-famine level by the 1920s. This prolonged demographic decline resulted from a combination of continued emigration, delayed marriage patterns, and reduced fertility rates that persisted long after the immediate crisis had ended. The medieval Great Famine appears to have created similar long-term demographic effects, though the evidence is less complete than for the Irish case. Irish records from England and France, where they survive, suggest that marriage ages increased significantly in the post-famine period, with both men and women waiting longer before starting families. Birth rates remained below pre-famine levels for several decades, and many communities never fully recovered their pre-crisis population numbers. The regional variations in demographic impact and recovery reveal the complex ways that geography, social structure, and economic conditions influenced survival during the crisis. England, with its relatively developed administrative system and maritime trade networks, experienced severe mortality but recovered more quickly than many continental regions. Detailed English records allow historians to track population changes with unusual precision, revealing mortality rates that vary dramatically by region and social class. The English countryside experienced some of the highest mortality rates, particularly in low-lying areas that were most affected by flooding. The Vale of York, the Somerset Levels, and the Thames Valley all suffered devastating population losses as persistent flooding made agriculture impossible and created conditions perfect for disease transmission. Entire villages were abandoned as their populations either died or fled to seek survival elsewhere. The 100 rolls of 1279 and the subsidy rolls of 1327 provide before and after snapshots that reveal the extent of population loss in rural England. Villages that had housed hundreds of families in 1279 were reduced to a few dozen survivors by 1327. In some cases, villages that had existed for centuries were completely abandoned, their names surviving only in old documents and archaeological sites. Urban areas in England fared somewhat better than rural regions, partly because cities could import food from distant areas and partly because urban authorities were better organized to coordinate relief efforts. However, cities also became overcrowded with rural refugees, creating conditions that contributed to the spread of disease and social unrest. London's population, which had grown dramatically during the prosperity of the 13th century, stagnated during the famine years and did not resume significant growth until the late 14th century. Scotland's demographic catastrophe was complicated by the ongoing wars with England, which added military casualties to famine deaths. The Scottish Wars of Independence, which continued throughout the famine period, created a compound disaster where starvation and violence reinforced each other. Scottish armies deliberately targeted English agricultural resources, burning crops and slaughtering livestock, while English forces retaliated in kind. Scottish chroniclers recorded population losses that may have exceeded even those experienced in England, though the evidence is less complete due to the destruction of records during the warfare. The Chronicle of John Barber describes conditions in southern Scotland where the land lay waste and empty, with neither man nor beast to be seen for miles, and the few survivors like walking skeletons searching among the ruins for anything that might sustain life. Ireland experienced what may have been the most severe demographic catastrophe of any region affected by the Great Famine. The island's population, which had grown substantially during the 13th century, appears to have declined by as much as 30–40% during the crisis years. The combination of crop failures, livestock mortality, and ongoing warfare between Gaelic Irish and Anglo-Norman settlers created conditions of unprecedented devastation. Irish Gaelic sources describe conditions of such severity that they exceed even the dramatic accounts from continental chroniclers. The annals of Connacht record that in 1315 there was great famine and want throughout all Ireland, so that men ate each other, while the annals of Ulster described such mortality of men and beasts that the quick were hardly able to bury the dead. Continental Europe showed equally dramatic but very demographic patterns that reflected the diverse geography and political structures of the region. The Low Countries, with a high population density and dependence on grain agriculture, experienced catastrophic mortality rates. Flanders, one of medieval Europe's most prosperous and densely populated regions, lost an estimated 20–30% of its population during the famine years. The famous cloth-making cities that had been centers of international commerce became depopulated ruins where grass grew in formerly busy market squares. Bruges, which had been one of Europe's wealthiest cities, saw its population fall from perhaps 200,000 inhabitants to fewer than 100,000. The economic consequences were devastating, as the cloth industry that had made Flanders prosperous collapsed along with its workforce. France experienced highly variable demographic impacts that reflected the country's diverse geography and fragmented political structure. Northern French regions that were dependent on grain agriculture suffered losses comparable to England and Flanders. The chronicles of Jean de Venette provide detailed accounts of mortality in a Paris region, describing conditions where the dead were so numerous that they could not all be buried, and bodies lay in the streets until the few survivors could dig graves in the frozen ground. Southern France, with its more diverse agricultural systems and access to Mediterranean trade routes, experienced less severe demographic losses but was not entirely spared. The region's wine-producing areas were particularly affected as unseasonable weather destroyed grape harvests for several consecutive years, eliminating a crucial source of both nutrition and economic activity. The German states presented an even more complex demographic picture that reflected the highly fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Regions along major rivers like the Rhine and Danube, which had better access to trade networks and food imports, experienced lower mortality rates than isolated areas. The Rhineland cities, with their established commercial networks, were able to import grain from distant regions that had not been affected by the famine. Mountain regions in Bavaria and Austria suffered some of the highest mortality rates in Europe, with some communities experiencing complete depopulation. The combination of geographic isolation, dependence on marginal agricultural lands, and harsh climate made these regions particularly vulnerable to crop failures. Many alpine communities that had been established during the medieval warm period were permanently abandoned during the Great Famine. Technological and agricultural innovations that emerged from the Great Famine represented one of the most significant and lasting responses to the crisis. The complete breakdown of traditional farming systems forced communities to experiment with new approaches to agriculture that might be more resistant to climate disasters and more efficient in their use of available resources. These innovations would prove crucial not only for immediate recovery but for the long-term development of European agriculture. The development of improved food preservation techniques accelerated dramatically during the crisis and recovery periods as communities recognized the critical importance of maintaining emergency food supplies. Traditional methods of drying, salting, and smoking were refined and expanded to handle larger quantities of food more effectively and to preserve food for longer periods. The knowledge gained during the crisis years about food preservation would prove invaluable for centuries to come. The technique of smoke drying fish and meat became much more sophisticated during this period, with communities developing specialized smokehouses that could preserve large quantities of protein for months or even years. These facilities represented significant investments of labor and resources, but they provided crucial insurance against future food shortages. The preserved foods produced in these smokehouses could sustain communities through the hungry months of late winter and early spring when fresh food was scarce. Fermentation techniques for preserving vegetables also advanced significantly during the recovery period. The process of making sauerkraut, which could preserve cabbage for months while actually improving its nutritional content through the production of vitamins, became widespread across northern Europe. Similar fermentation techniques were applied to other vegetables, creating preserved foods that provided essential vitamins and minerals during times of scarcity. The construction of community granaries became a much higher priority for post-famine communities, representing a fundamental shift from individual to collective approaches to food security. Before the crisis, most food storage had been handled by individual households, with only the wealthy and religious institutions maintaining significant reserves. The famine had demonstrated the vulnerability of this decentralized system, leading to the development of communal storage facilities that could maintain larger reserves and distribute food during emergencies. These community granaries were not simple storage buildings but sophisticated systems that incorporated the latest knowledge about grain preservation. They featured raised floors to prevent moisture damage from ground seepage, elaborate ventilation systems to maintain air circulation and prevent spoilage, and integrated pest control measures to prevent insect and rodent damage. The walls were often built with special lime mortars that helped repel insects, and the roofs were designed to shed water effectively while providing access for loading and unloading grain. The construction of these facilities required unprecedented levels of community cooperation and represented significant investments of resources and labor. Communities had to pool their financial resources, coordinate work schedules, and develop systems for managing shared facilities. The social institutions that developed around community granaries had lasting impacts on European political and economic development, as they required new forms of governance that could coordinate collective action and make decisions about resource allocation. Water management systems also improved dramatically in response to the flooding that had characterized the famine years. Communities invested heavily in drainage systems, dikes, flood control structures, and irrigation networks designed to prevent the kind of waterlogging that had destroyed crops during 1350–1317. These projects represented some of the most sophisticated engineering undertakings of the medieval period. The Low Countries became particularly innovative in water management, developing techniques that would serve as models for similar projects across Europe and eventually around the world. The construction of polders, areas of land reclaimed from water through elaborate drainage systems, accelerated during the post-famine period as communities sought to expand the amount of land available for agriculture. These projects required unprecedented levels of technical expertise and coordinated labor. The engineering challenges involved in polder construction were enormous. Communities had to survey vast areas of waterlogged land, design complex drainage systems that could handle varying water levels, and construct dikes and sluices that could withstand the pressure of water and weather. The knowledge and experience gained from these projects contributed to improvements in engineering and construction techniques that had applications far beyond agriculture. Agricultural diversification became much more common in post-famine Europe as communities recognized the dangers of depending too heavily on single crops. The monoculture grain farming that had characterized much of medieval agriculture during the prosperous centuries was gradually replaced by more diverse cropping systems that provided some protection against future crop failures. This diversification represented a fundamental shift in agricultural philosophy. The expansion of legume cultivation was particularly significant for both nutritional and agricultural reasons. Beans, lentils, peas, and other leguminous crops not only provided essential protein for recovering populations, but also improved soil fertility through their ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. This natural fertilization process was crucial during the recovery period when animal manure was scarce due to livestock losses. Medieval farmers gradually learned through experience that alternating legume crops with grains could actually improve soil productivity over time, leading to the development of more sophisticated crop rotation systems. The traditional three-field system that had been developed during the medieval warm period was modified to include more legumes and to provide better soil conservation during periods of adverse weather. Root vegetable cultivation expanded dramatically during the post-famine period, with turnips becoming particularly important for both human consumption and animal feed. Turnips could produce up to 4 times as much food per acre as traditional grain crops, making them essential for supporting population recovery with limited agricultural land. They could also be left in the ground through mild frosts, providing a living storage system that required no special facilities and could be harvested as needed throughout the winter. The cultivation of turnips and other root vegetables required the development of new farming techniques and specialized tools. Traditional plows designed for grain crops were not suitable for root vegetables, leading to innovations in agricultural equipment. Farmers developed new techniques for soil preparation, planting, and harvesting that maximized root vegetable production. The knowledge gained from root vegetable cultivation would later play a crucial role in supporting the population growth of early modern Europe. Tree crop cultivation also received increased attention during the recovery period as communities sought food sources that were less vulnerable to annual weather variations than field crops. Apple orchards, nut groves, and other tree crops provided food sources that could survive bad weather that would destroy annual crops, offering food security over multiple years. The development of better orchard management techniques, including pruning, grafting, and pest control, became more sophisticated during this period. The economic transformations that flowed from the Great Famine created fundamental changes in European society that persisted long after the immediate crisis had ended. The demographic collapse that resulted from the famine created the first significant labor shortage in European history since the fall of the Roman Empire, fundamentally altering the relationship between workers and employers and setting in motion economic changes that would ultimately contribute to the end of feudalism. This labor scarcity gave surviving workers unprecedented bargaining power, leading to wage increases and improvements in working conditions that would have been unimaginable before the crisis. Medieval wage records from England show that real wages, the purchasing power of workers' earnings, increased dramatically during the post-famine period as employers competed for scarce labor. These wage increases represented a fundamental shift in the balance of economic power. The breakdown of traditional feudal labor relationships forced communities to develop new forms of economic organization based on market relationships rather than customary obligations. The feudal system, which had been based on land grants in exchange for military service and agricultural labor, became increasingly unworkable when there weren't enough people to fulfill these traditional roles. This breakdown created opportunities for new forms of economic organization to emerge. Money wages became more important as communities could no longer rely on traditional forms of payment in kind. This transition to a more monetized economy required the development of more sophisticated financial systems, including better banking arrangements, credit mechanisms, and commercial networks. The increased importance of money in daily economic life contributed to the growth of commercial cities and the rise of merchant classes as powerful economic actors. The scarcity of agricultural labor also encouraged investments in labor-saving technologies and more efficient farming methods. Communities that had previously relied on abundant cheap labor now had to find ways to accomplish the same work with fewer people. This pressure for efficiency drove innovations in agricultural tools, techniques, and organization that improved overall productivity and contributed to long-term economic growth. Urban economic power rose relative to rural agricultural production during the post-famine period, as cities proved more adaptable to changed circumstances than rural feudal estates. Urban merchants and craftsmen who had survived the crisis were in strong positions to take advantage of new economic opportunities created by labor scarcity and changing market conditions. The wealth and organizational capabilities of merchant classes made them important political actors in ways that had been less common before the crisis. The development of more sophisticated manufacturing techniques also advanced during the recovery period as communities needed to produce more goods with fewer workers. The guild system that governed medieval manufacturing became more flexible and innovative as it adapted to changed circumstances. New techniques in textile production, metalworking, and other crafts were developed to meet the challenges of producing goods with scarce labor. International trade networks that had been disrupted during the famine years were built with important modifications that reflected lessons learned during the crisis. The new trade relationships that emerged placed greater emphasis on food security, diversified supply sources, and emergency planning. Merchants and governments recognized the importance of maintaining access to multiple sources of essential goods to prevent future crises. The grain trade, in particular, became more sophisticated and far-reaching during the recovery period. Eastern European regions that had been less affected by the famine became important sources of grain for Western European markets. The development of this east-west grain trade represented one of the most significant developments in European commerce during the 14th century, creating economic relationships that would persist for centuries. The cultural and intellectual legacy of the Great Famine was equally profound and persistent, creating changes in European thought and culture that would influence development for centuries. The crisis had shattered the optimistic worldview that had characterized the High Middle Ages, replacing it with a much more pessimistic understanding of human existence that emphasized the fragility of prosperity and the constant threat of disaster. This cultural transformation was reflected in virtually every aspect of European intellectual life. The confident scholastic philosophy of the 13th century, which had attempted to create comprehensive intellectual systems that reconciled faith and reason, gave way to more skeptical approaches that emphasized the limitations of human knowledge and the unpredictability of divine will. The writings of philosophers like William of Ockham and John Duns Scotus reflect this shift toward more cautious and skeptical approaches to knowledge. Theological thinking was particularly affected by the famine experience. The traditional Christian explanation that God rewarded the righteous and punished the wicked had been challenged by the reality of mass suffering that seemed to affect good and evil people equally. This theological crisis contributed to the development of new forms of Christian thought that would ultimately lead to significant religious reforms in the later medieval and early modern periods. The emergence of mystical religious movements during the post-famine period reflected the inadequacy of traditional religious explanations for the disasters that had occurred. Movements that emphasized direct personal experience of the divine, rather than institutional religious authority, gained followers among populations that had witnessed the failure of traditional religious institutions to prevent or explain the crisis. The writings of mystics like Meister Eckhart and Johannes Toller became increasingly popular during this period. Artistic traditions underwent equally dramatic transformations that reflected the changed cultural atmosphere. The confident, optimistic art of the high medieval period was replaced by darker, more somber works that dealt explicitly with themes of death, suffering, and human mortality. The memento mori tradition, which reminded viewers of the constant presence of death, became central to European art in ways that would have been foreign to pre-famine culture. The dance of death artistic tradition, which showed death leading people from all walks of life in a macabre procession, emerged directly from the cultural trauma of the Great Famine and was later reinforced by the Black Death. These artistic representations served both as religious instruction and as ways for communities to process their traumatic memories of mass mortality. The earliest known dance of death artwork dates from the 1320s, just a few years after the end of the Great Famine. Illuminated manuscripts, which had been one of the primary forms of artistic expression during the medieval period, showed dramatic changes in both content and style. Where earlier manuscripts emphasized bright colors, optimistic religious themes, and scenes of earthly prosperity, post-famine manuscripts incorporated darker palettes, more frequent depictions of death and judgment, and increased emphasis on human suffering and divine wrath. Literary traditions were similarly transformed by the famine experience. The heroic literature that had characterized early medieval culture, with its emphasis on noble deeds, courtly love, and romantic adventure, was supplemented by more realistic works that dealt honestly with themes of survival, social breakdown, and human mortality. The emergence of more realistic literary traditions that portrayed the actual conditions of medieval life can be traced directly to the cultural changes initiated by the Great Famine. Folk culture that emerged from the famine period preserved memories of the crisis in forms that continued to influence popular consciousness for generations. Folk tales, songs, ballads, and oral traditions that dealt with themes of hunger, abandonment, survival, and social upheaval became integral parts of European culture. These cultural products served both as entertainment and as ways for communities to process and preserve their traumatic memories. The story of Hansel and Gretel provides the most famous example of how famine memories were preserved in folk culture. This tale, with its themes of parental abandonment during times of scarcity, children forced to survive on their own in a hostile world, and the fantasy of houses made of food, clearly reflects the traumatic experiences of families during the Great Famine. The gingerbread house represents the impossible dream of abundant food that haunted survivors for generations. But Hansel and Gretel was only one of many folk tales that preserve famine memories. Stories about cannibalistic witches, magic food that disappears when touched, children who must outwit adults to survive, and communities that turn against each other during times of scarcity all reflect the cultural trauma of the famine years. These tales served as both entertainment and as vehicles for transmitting important survival knowledge to future generations. Musical traditions also showed the profound influence of the famine experience. Sacred music, which had dominated medieval musical culture, began to incorporate more somber tones and darker themes that reflected the spiritual crisis brought on by mass suffering. The confident, triumphant Gregorian chant traditions that had characterized earlier periods gave way to more mournful compositions that emphasized human frailty and divine judgment. Secular music showed even more dramatic changes, with the emergence of new song forms that dealt explicitly with themes of hunger, death, social upheaval, and survival. Folk ballads that emerged from the famine period often dealt with the breakdown of traditional social relationships and a struggle for survival during times of scarcity. These songs served as both entertainment and as ways for communities to preserve and transmit their collective memories of the crisis. The political consequences of the Great Famine continued to unfold throughout the later medieval period, fundamentally altering the balance of power within European society and contributing to the development of new forms of government and political organization. The crisis had demonstrated the fundamental inadequacy of medieval governmental systems in managing large-scale disasters, revealing the need for more effective administrative systems. Kings and nobles who claimed to rule by divine right found their authority questioned when they proved helpless against natural catastrophes. The social contract that formed the basis of feudal society, protection in exchange for service, was broken when protection proved impossible to provide. This breakdown of traditional authority relationships created opportunities for new forms of political organization to emerge and establish precedents for questioning royal authority. The development of more effective government administration was driven partly by the recognition that better coordination was necessary during emergencies. The famine had revealed the weaknesses of medieval administrative systems, leading to improvements in record-keeping, communication networks, and bureaucratic procedures that would have broader applications beyond crisis management. These administrative improvements contributed to the development of more modern forms of state organization. Urban governments gained power relative to rural nobility partly because cities had often managed the crisis more effectively than feudal lords. Urban authorities had proven better at coordinating relief efforts, maintaining order during the crisis, and organizing recovery programs. This relative success gave cities increased political influence and economic resources, contributing to the rise of urban political power that would characterize the later medieval period. The rise of merchant political power reflected the increased importance of commercial relationships in post-famine society. Merchants who had survived the crisis and maintained trade networks found themselves in positions of increased influence due to their wealth, organizational capabilities, and essential economic functions. The political power of merchant classes would continue to grow throughout the later medieval period. The peasant rebellions that characterized the late 14th century can all be traced directly to the social changes initiated by the Great Famine. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, the Jacquerie in France, the Sampi revolt in Florence, and similar uprisings across continental Europe all reflected the breakdown of traditional social relationships that had begun during the famine years. These rebellions represented more than simple economic grievances. They reflected a fundamental shift in social consciousness that had been triggered by the experience of witnessing the complete breakdown of traditional social order during the crisis. The assumption that social hierarchy was divinely ordained and therefore unquestionable had been shattered by the demonstrated inability of traditional authorities to protect their subjects during times of crisis. The environmental legacy of the Great Famine extended far beyond the immediate agricultural disaster, creating ecological changes that persisted for centuries and fundamentally altered the relationship between human society and the natural environment. The demographic collapse that resulted from the crisis led to the abandonment of marginal agricultural lands that had been brought into cultivation during the earlier period of population expansion. This agricultural contraction allowed forests to regenerate and ecosystems to recover in ways that had not been possible during the intensive cultivation of the high medieval period. Large areas of Europe that had been cleared for agriculture during the 11th and 12th centuries reverted to woodland during the post-famine period. The abandoned villages and farmsteads became archaeological sites, while the former fields returned to forest. The reforestation that occurred during the post-famine period may have had important consequences for regional climate patterns. Forests affect local weather conditions through their influence on temperature, humidity, and precipitation patterns. The expansion of forest cover that occurred as agricultural lands were abandoned may have contributed to the persistence of the Little Ice Age climate conditions by changing regional weather patterns. The changes in land use patterns also had important consequences for wildlife populations. Species that had been displaced by agricultural expansion during the High Middle Ages were able to recolonize areas where human populations had declined. Wolves, bears, and other large mammals returned to regions where they had been eliminated during the period of agricultural expansion. This ecological recovery represented one of the few positive environmental consequences of the demographic disaster. The connection between the Great Famine and the Black Death pandemic that struck Europe 30 years later has become increasingly clear through modern scientific research, revealing a causal relationship that medieval observers suspected but could not prove. The relationship between these two catastrophes was not merely chronological but involved complex biological, social, and environmental interactions that created conditions for unprecedented mortality. Modern medical research has clarified the biological mechanisms by which prolonged malnutrition increases vulnerability to infectious disease. The protein-energy malnutrition that was widespread during the Great Famine compromises the immune system in multiple ways, reducing the body's ability to produce antibodies, decreasing white blood cell counts, and impairing the function of immune organs. These effects make individuals much more susceptible to bacterial and viral infections. The specific type of malnutrition that characterized the famine years, prolonged protein deficiency combined with caloric insufficiency, would have made European populations particularly vulnerable to the pneumonic form of plague that was responsible for much of the Black Death's mortality. Malnourished individuals have reduced ability to fight off respiratory infections, making them ideal victims for the plague bacterium when it arrived in Europe. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries provides additional confirmation of the connection between famine and plague vulnerability. Skeletal remains from the pre-plague period show clear signs of malnutrition-related stress, including stunted growth, bone deformities, dental problems, and evidence of recurring disease. The bones of individuals who lived through the Great Famine show characteristic signs of nutritional stress that would have left them vulnerable to subsequent health crises. The social disruption caused by the Great Famine also contributed to the rapid spread of plague when it arrived. Traditional community structures that might have provided support during health crises had been weakened or destroyed by the earlier catastrophe. The mobility of post-famine populations, as people moved in search of better opportunities, facilitated the transmission of disease across Europe. Urban areas that had served as refuges for rural populations during the famine years had become overcrowded and unsanitary, creating ideal conditions for disease transmission. The concentration of malnourished populations in cities made these areas particularly vulnerable when the plague arrived. Many of the urban centers that had grown during the famine recovery period became death traps during the Black Death. The compound effect of famine followed by plague created mortality rates that were unprecedented in European history. Regions that had been most severely affected by the Great Famine also showed the highest mortality rates during the Black Death, suggesting that the earlier crisis had created conditions that made the later pandemic much more deadly. England, northern France, and the Low Countries, which had suffered the worst famine mortality, also experienced the most devastating plague deaths. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration of the Great Famine of 1350–1317, we must remember that behind every statistic, every chronicle entry, every economic analysis, there were individual human beings whose lives were forever changed by this catastrophe. These were not abstract historical figures, but real people, farmers and merchants, mothers and children, craftsmen and clergy who faced unimaginable hardship with remarkable courage and resilience. The personal accounts that have survived from this period reveal the full spectrum of human response to extreme adversity. We see acts of extraordinary selflessness, like the parents who gave their last food to their children and the wealthy who distributed their resources to the starving. We see incredible ingenuity as communities developed new ways to preserve food, new crops to grow, and new systems to prevent future disasters. We see profound faith tested and sometimes broken, but also renewed and strengthened by suffering. The women who walked miles carrying dying children, searching for someone who might help them survive another day. The men who worked in flooded fields until they collapsed from exhaustion, trying to salvage something from the ruined harvest. The children who learned to find nourishment in tree bark and grass, adapting to a world that seemed determined to destroy them. These individuals faced circumstances that would challenge the strongest among us. But what emerges most clearly from these accounts is not just the horror of their suffering, but the dignity with which they endured it. Medieval chroniclers repeatedly expressed amazement at the patience, compassion, and mutual support that ordinary people showed even in the face of starvation. Communities that could have descended into violent anarchy instead often found ways to share their meager resources and support their most vulnerable members. The technological innovations, agricultural improvements, and social changes that emerged from the Great Famine demonstrate humanity's remarkable capacity for learning and adaptation. The crop diversification that made European agriculture more resilient, the food preservation techniques that prevented future famines, the water management systems that protected against flooding, all of these advances emerged from the creativity and determination of people who refused to simply accept their fate. The cultural and artistic legacy of the Great Famine reveals how human beings process trauma and find meaning in suffering. The folk tales that preserve memories of these dark years, the artistic traditions that helped communities understand their experiences, the religious movements that offered new forms of comfort and hope all demonstrate the human need to create meaning from even the most devastating experiences. The Great Famine of 1350–1317 stands as one of the most significant events in human history, marking the end of the medieval era and the beginning of a new phase of European development. Its legacy continues to influence our understanding of the relationship between human society and environmental change, providing valuable insights that remain profoundly relevant as our own world faces the challenges of climate change. The scientific evidence reveals that the Great Famine was caused by the same kind of rapid climate change that our world is experiencing today. The volcanic eruptions, oceanic circulation changes, and solar variations that triggered the Little Ice Age provide sobering parallels to the complex climate dynamics affecting our modern world. The medieval experience demonstrates how quickly apparently stable civilizations can be disrupted by environmental changes beyond their control. But the Great Famine also demonstrates human resilience and adaptability in the face of overwhelming challenges. The innovations in agriculture, technology, and social organization that emerged from the crisis helped create the foundation for the eventual recovery and prosperity of early modern Europe. The lessons learned about food security, emergency planning, and social cooperation remain relevant today as we face our own environmental challenges. The demographic transformations that flowed from the Great Famine fundamentally altered European society, creating opportunities for social mobility, economic innovation, and political change that would have been impossible under the old system. The breakdown of feudalism, the rise of market economics, and the development of more effective governmental systems all emerged from the social disruption caused by the crisis. The cultural changes initiated by the Great Famine, the emphasis on preparing for disaster, the recognition of human vulnerability, the importance of community cooperation created attitudes and institutions that helped European society become more resilient and adaptable. These cultural adaptations proved crucial during subsequent crises and contributed to Europe's eventual emergence as a dominant force in world history. As we face our own environmental challenges in the 21st century, the experience of the Great Famine provides both warnings and inspiration. The medieval crisis demonstrates how quickly climate change can disrupt human society, but it also shows how communities can adapt, innovate, and ultimately emerge stronger from even the most devastating disasters. The people who lived through the Great Famine could not have imagined that their suffering would provide lessons that remain relevant 7 centuries later. but their experience continues to teach us about both the vulnerability of human civilization to environmental change and the remarkable capacity of human communities to survive, adapt, and find ways to build better futures from the ruins of the past. In the end, the story of the Great Famine is not just about death and destruction, but about life and renewal. It is about the farmers who developed new crops that could survive harsh conditions, the engineers who built water management systems that prevented future floods, the merchants who created trade networks that provided food security, the artists who found ways to express hope in the midst of despair, and the ordinary families who somehow found the strength to continue loving and caring for each other even when their world was falling apart. Their courage in enduring unendurable conditions, their determination to protect their families despite impossible odds, and their ability to find moments of joy and connection in the midst of suffering, testify to the strength of the human spirit and remind us of our shared humanity. So the next time you think about medieval history, whether reading about grand castles or famous battles, remember the untold millions who lived through the Great Famine not as lords and ladies, but as farmers and workers, mothers and children, craftsmen and merchants whose lives were shaped by suffering but who remained fundamentally human despite the disaster's attempts to destroy them. Their stories matter, because they remind us that history is not just about great events and famous people, but about the daily experiences of ordinary people who deserve to be remembered, honored, and never forgotten. Remember them, because in remembering them, we honor the best of our own humanity, and commit ourselves to building a world where no one will have to endure what they endured just to survive. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey through the Great Famine of 1350–1317. Until next time, this has been another episode of Lazy History, where we uncover the truths that textbooks prefer to forget.